All right, so we're continuing with major modification, significant emission increase. And we said that in the heart of this was this definition of baseline actual. We've been kind of talking all around that definition now, but it is a central feature in the EPA's 2002 or December 31st, 2001 NSR reform rules. And the reason this came about, keep in mind, you know, this is the Bush administration, and the regulated community was experiencing a lot of low past actuals. I mean, we're kind of in a depressed economy, and the market conditions were really, really low. So when they were looking at past actual, this 2-year actual, right? Those are really low numbers. So when they went in to permit something, you know, almost any kind of change threw them into PSD, and they said, you know, this isn't quite right. We need a break because of some of the market conditions. So they broadened this average annual emissions during any consecutive 24-month period in the last 10 years. They broadened the past 2 years to that definition. And that's now, it was considered a major victory in NSR reform to let you look back 10 years, determine what your past emissions were, rather than the 2 years preceding the change, okay? So, and keep in mind, as we were talking about earlier, that this old actual emission definition, this 24-month period preceding the change, is still retained for conducting the air quality analysis, the modeling analysis, and for computing offset credits, which we'll talk about a lot on day 3, the last day, okay? So how does that baseline actuals work? Here's a case study. You can see we've got 2005 to 2014 emissions. Our highest 2 years look to be 2006 and 2007. So the old rule would have said we have to average this 60 and 80 and come up with an average of 70. But the new rule lets us look back 10 years, so our baseline actual is 95. It makes a big difference when you start talking about applicability. All right, so since we had no additional requirements or emission limitations, we can use this baseline period of 2006, 2007 without any adjustment. Let's kind of expand a case. Again, we have emissions 2005 to 14, and 2006 and 2007 again look like the highest couple of years, but you can see something kind of funky happen between 2008 and 2009. 2008 emissions being 805 and then jumping it way down to 75. So the old rule would have had us average these past 2 years and come up with 73 tons. And we noticed that the reason that this jumped down so much between 8 and 9 is there was a requirement to put on a scrubber to control VOCs by 90%. So our new rule, our average emissions equal 210 tons, right? This 860, 960 divided by 2. But because we have this requirement for the scrubber controls, we adjust those 2006, 2007 emissions by a 90% control, so 10% of that is 91 tons. But it still helps us. We can use our 91 tons for our baseline actual rather than this 73 tons.
So the requirement that required you to install a scrubber, does it matter what required you to install it?
Yes, I mean, it does matter if it was voluntary, but if it's a requirement, if it was voluntary reduction, you wouldn't have to count it. But if it's a requirement, say maybe it's a SIP rule, a RAC rule, maybe it was NSPS, maybe it was a consent decree, all those kind of things, you would have to make this adjustment for.
It's tricky as if it was like an ESHAP rule. It didn't really regulate VOC, but has the net effect of regulating VOC because it increased the benzene concentration. Most states will figure that as being a requirement, so you have to take it into account. Because it's a requirement that you couldn't do otherwise. You couldn't operate it with a higher VOC rate than that's required because of the ESHAP rule. But
yeah, if you had a permit.
Non-VOCs that you're controlling that aren't part of that rule, you could probably take out. It actually gets more complicated. Plus, this is the easiest case now. If you have 3 or 4 different rules kicking in at different time periods,
That's correct. Yeah, and the way I like to think of it is, unless it's voluntary, you're going to have to make the reduction. Okay, so let's talk. We're still talking about baseline actual emissions. You know, sometimes we talk about this look-back period. That's the 10-year period. Important concept. You can use the same 24-month period for every pollutant, right? You have to just choose one VOC time period or one SO2 time period. But those periods could be different for the different pollutants. Like VOC could have been 2006, 2007, but particulate could have been, you know, a different time period, 2009, 2010 or something, okay? And we...
You can't mix and match months. It has to be continuous 24 months.
Right. Right. And we make adjustments to this baseline actual emissions for anything that's non-compliant. I mean, if your actual emissions are higher because you had a bunch of emission events or flaring episodes and you're over your permit, guess what? They're not going to give you credit for that. When you talk about past emissions, you've got to take those emissions out. If they're over your
permit limit.
They're down to your permit limit, that's right. Emissions exceeding your current permit limit, your NSS, even if they weren't applicable during the 24-month period you selected, they have to be adjusted. Okay. Baseline actual emissions are used for a couple of different purposes. I mean, we're talking about considering for calculating our emission increases and decreases for our project affected emission units or existing emission units. You also use baseline actuals in some states to calculate your contemporaneous emission increases and decreases. You know, you need to check your SIP, but I noticed that Texas actually got the word baseline actuals in their rules for comparison between the potential to emit and their baseline actuals rather than their past actuals. Some states it's not that way. So you need to check your rules, but you know, baseline actual concept comes in three different places. Evaluating your existing project for your existing units in your contemporaneous period, and then establishing a PAL. If you want to establish a PAL, we'll talk about those on another day, but use that baseline actual emissions to do that too. That's what the PAL is based on. So let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about projected actual emissions, because this is the other big part of the Reform Act. We got baseline actuals, and now we've got projected actuals. So this is a kind of a new concept, and it's tricky. And here's what it says. How do you make the projection? For existing units, project the maximum temperature rate, considering the business activity with information such as stockholder prospectus, loan applications, et cetera. And this is actually written in the Federal Register. That tells you what this projected actual is supposed to be based on. And it's important. It's your projection, and you should be able to base it on your business cycle information. You use a 10-year projection for projects that increase capacity or increase PTE, a 5-year projection for other projects. And this projection is based on a 30-day hourly emission rate from which you project annual utilization. Don't get too hung up on that now. We're going to talk about that with regard to Northampton and Georgia Pacific in just a minute. The projection includes fugitive startup shutdowns and malfunctions according to the federal regulations. I just told you just the opposite, right? I told you it couldn't include any emission limits so that they're exceeding your permit, right? So if your malfunctions somehow get in there, it's a tricky term, and I've had a whole lot of people say, you know, what does that mean? Because you can't have anything in your baseline actual that was an upset anyway. Well, the only thing it could mean is malfunctions that were permitted, because that's the only thing that's allowed. Texas dropped that word malfunctions in their rules, and it says shutdowns and maintenance startup shutdown. Maintenance startup and shutdowns. That word malfunction doesn't occur. So it implies that, and EPA approved it, right? They approved it in the SIP process. So it applies that, that to me implies that EPA is taking the same interpretation for what this word malfunction means with regard to baseline actuals. It means, you know, I don't know how you permit a malfunction,
No one
but
wants to predict a malfunction is actually going to happen, right? I mean, you're going to prevent it from happening, so it doesn't make sense on all kinds of logical levels. That you're supposed to predict how many malfunctions you have every year and include those emissions into your thing. If they're routine enough emissions, you're supposed to be permitted to keep it from being malfunctions.
Right.
If they're routine, then they can't be malfunctions. They have to be actual emissions counted in your inventory.
yeah,
It's a bad word to put in there for lots of reasons.
right, right.
Things that are really putting, you know, all your emissions, startup, shutdown emissions, things that do happen on a routine basis.
They're predictable and routine. Yeah. So let's look at it graphically. We got a past 2-year actual level that's, you know, and theoretically your baseline actual, because you're looking 10 years back, could be a little bit higher than that. And then your PT, or potential to emit, could be a little bit higher than that, right? So here comes our project, and we want to increase our PTE after the project. It's going to be up by, let's just say, that amount. And our projected actual, our actual emissions that we're projecting because of this project could be lower than that PTE. So before the reform rules, we just look at our future PTE minus our past 2-year actual, and you can see that's a pretty big number. It could be. The way I drew the chart, it's real big. But now we're looking at the difference between our projected actual and our baseline actual, which could be quite a bit smaller number, right? Does that make sense to you? This is the way it used to be, and this is the way we could do it after reform. You know, you have the option of doing this bar too. But either way, it's better, you know, than this amount. Okay, so I want to make sure everybody's anchored that concept, because we're going to use this graph going forward for a few more illustrations.
And that difference is a net emission, net project emission, project increase in emissions, what you're trying to represent.
Right.
Yeah, it's the projected emissions that are going to increase as a result of your current project.
The final number that goes into
You're so smart.
That's natural. You get ahead of yourself.
You're so smart. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I want to give everybody all back again, and still what we're talking about right now is just applicability. All right? But that's an excellent question, and you really got to watch your permitters, your permit writers at TCEQ, because you're doing this applicability step to show I don't trigger PSD, and you might have a projected actual there. Does that mean that's what's going to go in your permit? I'm going to show you later why that's not what should go in your permit. What should go in your permit is still your potential to emit. And I'll give you a definition and an anchor for that later. But boy, they're not going to want to do that. They're going to want to put in this applicability number. Okay, so that
That's just a PPT difference is going to go over the threshold. It's hard to explain to the public why your permitting is only a 42-ton increase, even though it doesn't have to be a PSD. That netting analysis is 28. That could happen pretty easily.
Okay, so let's look at a case study. And I probably should have done this one graphically too, but bear with me. We got a cement modification. It's got new total CO emissions of 925 tons per year. Baseline actual was 750 during 2009, 2010. And the proposed method to determine the adjustment to the projected actual based on the demand growth we're able to accommodate is as follows. So what have we got? We got a new PTE, we got a baseline actual, and we're gonna try to figure out what amount of this difference is as a result of or caused from our project. So let's talk about how we're going to, how can we do that? We propose to use the highest production for a 30-day consecutive period during the baseline actual period that we used, and we're going to annualize that emission from that production rate. And the reason I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the reason I'm using a 30-day period is because that's what EPA policy papers in Northampton and Georgia Pacific said you would do. And so they determined that the additional amount they were able to accommodate and deduct from the projected actual was 850, right? Minus the 750, which was the baseline actual. And that's 100 tons per year. Right, so the 925 minus the 100 tons is our projected actual. And when you do the projected actual managed baseline, you come out with 825 minus 750 or only 75 tons per year.
We know you're all thinking, well, just add to the baseline, so subtract it from 1012. Just the way it's described in the rule to do the math in that order.
Yep.
Mathematically, it works the same if you add it to the bottom or subtract it from the top. Calculate the difference to accommodate and then subtract it from the projected actual rather than add it to your baseline.
Yep.
Before you do the difference.
Yeah. So you can see it's going to make a difference in this case. And don't worry about this case too much. Let's just go on. And I'm going to show you this visually in a minute. If you do a projected actual and you do say, hey, I was able to accommodate this much before our project, even though my baseline was here, oh, I could really do this much more. And then I want to do this much more again because of my project. If you do that, it's a good argument. Now, all of us are going to have to be doing it more and more and more. But if you do it and you use this projected actual, the baggage it comes with is a little bit of record keeping and monitoring over the next 5-year period to show that you didn't go over that baseline actual period. So Marie, when you ask what goes in your permit, well, 2 things go in your permit. What goes in your emission rate table, your maximum allowable emission rate, is the PTE. But you're going to probably get a condition in your permit that says you're going to monitor to make sure you didn't go over your projected actual for a 5-year period because of the project. Okay, so that can be a little bit tricky too. So let's just keep moving forward. So here we got an example of using a baseline actual to project it, to a PTE or potential to emit test. And this is an existing major source in an attainment area. And we're looking at VOCs here. And the plant began operation in late 2012, so we got emissions from 2013 all the way to 2019. And our potential to emit that we want, that's what we want in our maximum allowable emission rate table, is 305 tons per year. But we're only projecting this project to take us up by these amounts that you see in 2015 through 2019. So how's all this going to work? In the pre-reform rules, we just say our PTE minus our past actual, that's 170 tons per year, so PSD applies, right? And the modification subject to PSD. But if we're using a baseline actual to projected actual test, let's walk through that same scenario. Our projected actual, you can see the highest one is in 2019, and it's only 170 tons per year, right? So our reform rule says, let's look at our projected actual minus our baseline actual. I have past actual there. So the difference there is only 35 tons per year. So the modification in this case, using this test, would not be subject to PSD. We wouldn't have to go through a PSD review. The baggage, we would get a monitoring condition in our permit that says you need to you must monitor the increases from this project and show that those increases don't go over 170 tons per year. And you need to do that for 5 years. Well, you can't go over it as a result of that project, but you can still, you know, let's say it's a tank or a flare or something like that, you could still go over it. And that's where the art of this monitoring requirement comes from.
That proves to be almost an impossibility.
It is an impossibility. I mean,
And it's like a synthetic minor because for that project, I mean, you know, it's, we talked about this and I play devil's advocate because I like to just pick whatever side somebody's opposite of, just so I get a chance to argue because that's what I really like to do. But it's you know, it's just.
in some cases, I completely agree with you. It's an impossibility. If you're at a big refinery, and I understand your point. If you're at a big refinery and you got a couple of tanks there that you know they take throughput from all kinds of sources, and you got a project, and you're going to say my projected tank increase because of this project is only, you know, 1,000 barrels per year or whatever. How are you going to monitor that 1,000 barrels when over the course of this 5 years you might have 10 other projects that could influence this tank? At some point that gets to be a really, really difficult thing to do. Other cases it's a lot simpler. You know, I see this used a lot for process heaters and boilers where it's a little bit easier for them to monitor the firing rate and kind of massage things where it doesn't.
Have you seen any good formats, forms, Excel spreadsheets, or anything that some company has used to track this? You go, really good organizational skills there. Have you seen anything that someone like me could steal? I mean, right now we just have it, you know, just
Yeah,
out in Excel and Word documents, and it's ugly, and it's
Yeah.
it's a really good example.
I know of one, but I mean it's a confidential. I mean I worked a lot with Exxon, and Exxon developed something that's a pretty good tool for doing this, but it's it's not something I could shoot you.
Something that's on like a DEQ website.
Yeah.
Or anything like that.
I haven't seen anything like that. Not for public. Yeah.
This is also a good example of one of the things that people hate about PSD is that you have like a boiler that's going to use capacity that you never use, and it's big PT, and every time you do PSD, you have to re-permit that same capacity over and over and over again. So if you're instead of going all the way to the top every time, now you just have to go what you actually think you're going to use for that project.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're running it at half speed and you're going to use 20% more for this project, then you only have to permit that 20% for your projected end, rather than 100% again. The next project, instead of doing another 100% again, you have to do the next 20%. And so you can use the capacity as you need it with this methodology, rather than having to permit the whole thing over every single time. And then every single time it's a PSD project because it's too big to begin with. And the penalty for that is if you trip PSD, the difference is always PSD. And so this allows you to avoid PSD possibly by just using what you need rather than the whole potential open source to go. And that goes for throughput for tanks, it goes for throughput for, capacity of boilers or heaters. A lot of things are built bigger than they need to be the first time. Just doing one, manufacturing, you do one shift instead of 3. Well, are you really going to need 3 shifts? No, we'll be lucky to get 2 shifts out of it in the next 10 years. Well, then you only have to permit that next shift rather than all 3. And it cuts your emissions by half of what your projected emissions are there. Going 2/3 instead of 3/3.
I'm seeing this used a lot now, but it's mainly it's being used for fired sources and less for things like tanks and flares and that have a lot of different projects that could be impacting it. But it's a powerful tool. It's a powerful clause that is keeping a lot of people out of a PSD review.
Has there ever been a suit filed by EPA against some facility that they didn't believe their numbers? Because, I mean, it'd be hard for EPA to prove that they lied on a reasonable possibility record keeping when, if I'm the one who does it, I wouldn't even be able to come up with a good number.
Yeah.
Did that ever come up?
I haven't seen it come up.
People have been sued in Ohio on the early days of this too, where they permitted it and they believe it, and they said, well, we have the record keeping to prove it, they were go over, you'll be the first to know, but there's no action until they actually go over it, so. And they haven't yet, so it's become kind of a thing that the environmental groups used to protest every single time one of these came out.
Yeah.
It's not being enforceable, and they said, of course it's enforceable, we got this record keeping to show when they go over and why they go over. Heaven forbid they ever do go over, they're gonna have to have a good reason for it, like explain another project or something else in permit.
Yeah.
So the record keeping is a serious thing. It's not something to be taken lightly. When you set that new limit of how much you really need, you better meet it. Engineering guys are meeting it, so.
Yeah. I think it's something that's going to get more and more scrutiny over the coming years than it has in the past, though, just because things are so tight with the NAAQS, the new NAAQS, and all the other hurdles that just make it tougher to get a PSD permit than it ever been in the before. So more and more people are using this approach to avoid PSDs. So I think there will be some additional scrutiny that maybe we haven't seen that much in the past. And I'm not sure how many people have actually taken advantage of this, you know.
Oh, we've got about 10 projects.
Yeah, I meant like 10 years ago when the rules came out, you know. But now it's different. It's a different game, and, you know, I use it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we have like 10 projects, 9 or 10 projects that have signatures record keeping.
Yeah. When we go through the step stuff, you guys are going to think it's pretty simple. But we're going to tell you exactly when to consider the use of projected actual, and when did it make any sense to use it? Did it make any difference to your answer in your applicability determination? For God's sake, don't use it. You know, just use a PTE instead of projected actual, and avoid this record keeping, you know, nightmare, which what could be a nightmare. But we're going to tell you exactly when to consider that when we get to the stepwise process. And you also mentioned a reasonable plausibility test. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a minute too, when that kicks in. Okay, so that's good. Man, we got some smart people out there. So when we're doing this projection, this projected actual, what can we exclude from the projected actual? And the PSD rules in 5221 say this: we can exclude the emissions that, one, the unit could have accommodated, and that's additional emissions during the 24-month baseline period that we chose. What could they accommodate during that period, and are unrelated to the project? And we'll talk about that in a second too. So this is just the increased utilization. It could be from market demand. It could be from anything, but it's got to be unrelated to the project. We're going to give you an example of that in a minute too. So here's one way to consider this demand growth or able to accommodate exclusion. This is our same chart that we had up here before, and now we're going to have a projected actual with our project that's going to be based on our business information. We're just going to make this projection. This is where we anticipate we're going to be. And then we're going to have this projected actual emission without the project, right? So what is that? That's the emissions unrelated to the project. This difference between the baseline actual and the projected actual is, well, we could have run up here. We were able to accommodate that many emissions before our project, right? That's the amount.
We never did during that baseline period. We actually didn't run it that much, but we expect to because of demand growth increase. The utilities are good at building cases. They have these curves every year. It gets a little bit more higher, more demand for electricity. So they can build a good case that's going to go up because of demand. If you're manufacturing tricycles, demand for the next 10 years and be able to make a standard economic argument that it's definitely going to go up instead of down. And that's the hard part about this, is you got to have a good argument that you can justify your demand growth into the future.
Right. So this is going to be the trick. We're going to talk about how you quantify this, because this is really the key factor, because this is the amount we're going to make our adjustment, the amount that we can make our adjustment.
And that still fits in within your PTE, right? I mean, you always had the PTE to do that much, you just never got around to it.
Yeah.
Never had to do it.
So this is the amount, remember the definition, that we can deduct from our projected actual, right? So what do we end up at when the day's over? We end up with this little space as being the emissions associated with our project when we do a projected actual to baseline actual. So you can see the math is going to, I mean, I've exaggerated probably some of the numbers on the bar, but you can see that this is a lot different from this, or even from this. You know, once we do our adjustment. So the art in all this is going to be figuring out how we determine this number. What could we have done before our project? What was our projected actual be before our project? Okay. So this throws us right into two of the really important EPA memorandum, the Georgia Pacific and the Northampton policies, which most states have taken up just almost like they're rulemaking now. And the memo states EPA's current position, and you know the one thing I want to tell you right now is EPA comes right out and says this is going to be inherently difficult to do. You know, you're going to have to really convince us that this is going to that you could have accommodated that. We want a demonstration that the emission unit, using demand growth, are able to accommodate, could operate at some achievable rate during the selected PSD baseline period. Okay, so they're going to say, you know what, it says this was your projection, that you could project it by your business perspective, prospectus, or your stockholder options, but not really. We don't want you to do that. We want you to show us during some period, and let's call it 30 days, that you actually did. Not that you could have accommodated it, but that you actually did accommodate it, at least through the 30-day period, which is a break. It's better than a yearly period or 24-month consecutive period, but it's still not quite right the way I read the rules. Could have accommodated means you could have accommodated. It doesn't mean you did actually accommodate, even if it's over a 30-day period. But that's the gist of Northampton and Georgia Pacific. They're saying, prove to us that you could have accommodated. Show us some operating data, at least over a 30-day period, where you can do that. And take that 30-day period, look at your projection rate, get your hourly emission rate, and annualize that, and we'll believe you that you could have accommodated that number, okay?
So flip-flop, and that's a lot, because what could have, you already did, and it's not a projection of something you actually did. So to get the project that you've never done, you have to have that 30 years of utility data with a straight line graph that goes up to be convincing. You know, nothing else short of that basically is going to be difficult for just demand growth in and of itself without the demonstration that could have accommodated that already happened for 30 days.
So this is
supposed to be the same, but they got kind of split into
right.
very tough to defend, the growth curve that you have never used, and a piece that you use for 30 days that you could have accommodated for longer than that.
Right. So this is my story where I rant incessantly about could have and did actually. So I'll skip that now. Our movie quote is from The Matrix. What is real? How do you define real? Well, EPA defines it a little differently than most of us. So I also feel obligated to point out that the information needed to make this projection, actual emissions, must be provided. They're going to want to review it. And it can't exceed any physical or legally enforceable emission limitations. So if you have a maximum rated capacity on a piece of equipment, it can't go past that. I mean, obviously, it should be set automatically. And that's a physical limitation. And legally enforceable, what that means is if you have a permit condition or limitation, you know, your projection can't go above that either, right? It's got to be something that was, you know, for you to say I could have accommodated something more than my permit limit, that's not going to fly. That's the ceiling, is what you're legally and physically able to do, which means your permit limitation or your NSPS limitation or whatever, and the limitations of the equipment itself. That's the constraints. All right? So I think if we look through this case study, maybe some of this come into play, and you'll see some of the complicated nature of doing this. This is a hypothetical case. I'm calling it a feed flexibility project. We got a baseline actual. This is our highest 24-month, right, over the last 10-year period. That's based on 40 ppm of H2S at a production of 100,000 barrels per day. Right? Our post-project projected actual, we want to base that. These guys are, our crack design team is saying, we think we can get this up to 140,000 barrels per day, and we really need to go up to 75 ppm H2S. That's what we're going to project as our actuals for the future. So how do we permit that? Well, the first thing we do is take a historical evaluation of this high 30-day periods during the baseline actual period that we chose, and select a couple of cases. So we go in and we do that. And we determined that our highest historical 30-day production, adjusted for utilization, during the baseline period was 120,000 barrels per day. But the actual data said during that period, when we're running 120, the sulfur H2S concentration was only 50 ppm, right? So we went in and looked at our highest 30-day production and said, okay, we hit 120,000 barrels per day, and when we did this, we had a 50 ppm concentration. So then we look at another case where our highest 30-day ppm was 60, but when that happened, the production was a little bit lower. See where I'm getting to? What were we able to accommodate? What is the data telling us here? Look at it. Let's look at it graphically. We have this baseline actual at 40 ppm, and that's when we're cranking out 100,000 barrels per day. And then we want this projected actual to be 140,000 barrels per day at 75 ppm. So that gives us a number there. And this projected actual without the modification, this is what we were able to accommodate, right? That's the question. How do we determine that? Because that's the amount we're going to adjust downward from our projected actual to get what we want to permit. Right here. All right, so this is what we're struggling with. How do we make this happen? Because when we looked at our 30-day production data, we had one 30-day period was kind of high in production, but the sulfur content was a little bit lower. And then the highest 30-day sulfur content had a little bit lower production than our highest production 30 days. Did I say that right? You see, so here's what we got to struggle with. What is our case study? What are we gonna propose? You know, the first thing would, based on the 120,000 barrel per day, the highest production during the baseline, and the 60 ppm, the highest 30-day sulfur content, that's what we'd love to permit, right?
That 60 ppm during
You and me,
You think this is?
you and I think alike. I'd say, look, we clearly demonstrated that we could accommodate this 60 ppm, and we clearly indicated our data shows we could do 120,000 barrels per day too.
Just during that 30-day period that we were really kicking it, we had a really good feeder.
Mm-hmm.
But we could do the higher production and the higher sulfur content.
Well, we showed them these things. The question is, did we show it to them simultaneously? Did we show them that we actually did accommodate this emission level? Well, we didn't, and I don't know what they're going to say. I'd go in and pitch this.
Like, again, it's
No.
like, it's a difference
No.
between saying you could have, it makes sense that you could have done both at some time because you established each one separately, but did you actually, during that 24-month period, actually hit that accommodation?
If I need to, do I need to go out and buy some really bad food? Do I need to do that for 30 days?
For 30 days, you do.
Really? Yeah, if we have a big project down the road, I need to go out and just pollute as much as I possibly can for 30 days to prove that.
Yeah, I don't write this stuff. You know, and if you're using logic, you're really going to get tripped up. It's going to really mess you up. But you know, I completely understand the irony of the situation, and you know, there are been a lot of probably boardroom conversations about this very topic. You know, and it gets back to the same thing: could have or did. You know, I think the rules say could have. I don't see anything wrong with number one. Did throws you into number two or number three, which says you got to pick one of these things where you did actually accommodate this level of emissions for a 30-day period. And you know, Texas fights me on this. They fight me like tooth and nail, and you know, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't matter, I just give them what they want. But I have not won this case yet.
It's hard enough making your criteria pollutants pick up a 2-year period that your criteria pollutants are all in agreement, much less about it.
It's conservative, you know, and that's what I don't like about this Northampton, Georgia Pacific paper and the way EPA's addressed the whole able to accommodate argument. It's not your projection anymore. It's what you've done. It's what you've done for 30 days. It's not your projection. And the rules are clear. It should be your projection. So, you know, take it up and fight it when it matters, and you know, good luck with it. Yeah.
Okay, what about,
But you see how complicated this gets, and
what about if that concentration, for instance, has nothing to do with the process? Let's say it's H2S concentration in your fuel gas, which is completely independent of anything else. Can you could say, you know, it's based on 162 for refineries, or on a 3-hour average is the ppm concentration, or projected. I mean, you're not really projecting you're going to do that, but are you limited by your highest H2S concentration you've seen for a 30-day stretch in the past couple of years?
That's what the,
according to this policy, according to the rules, I think it's your projection. But if they're adhering to this policy, they're saying,
That could fluctuate, you know. Then you're being penalized on your good performance in the past for your
Absolutely.
projection.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
and like Randy and I both have argued the other case, and they said, no, this thing says this is what you've actually done. We'll believe what you've actually done. We won't believe what you think you might be able to do. Even though the rule was kind of written to say, what do you think you can do?
Yeah.
So again, once
You
you
know-
sort of cut down from believing what you could do by proving that you've already done it. That's the best way to prove you could do something is by actually doing it.
Yeah.
And that's all, that's what they're locked into now.
So, I mean, it gets down to this. How important is this argument for you? Is it going to cause your project to cross over the applicability threshold? You know, it's time like this when it's fun to be a consultant. I love to argue these kind of things. Unfortunately, you guys have a plant to run, and you have to get on with business and probably, you know, choose your battles accordingly. So, this is just kind of to illustrate some of the issues that you're going to get into with your agency almost every time you try to use this argument, because there's a lot of gray. We can talk about these things conceptually, but when we put a case study on it, you can see it gets, even a simple case study gets pretty complicated pretty quick. Okay?
So your point is, well, it's exactly to the heart of the argument that what that controversy is all about. So.
Yeah. So how's this going to look on our, I'm sorry, did you?
As going then you throw in the, like we talking about, the total reduced sulfur. That's a magic number that's supposed to make up or something.
Yeah.
Test for that, depending on which one to do, okay.
Right. So these things are lying in wait, but just looking at our project the way we've been in the same graph, if we did this projected actual with a 30-day, whatever the highest pound per hour number came out, we would have some projected actual. We would adjust our projected actual downward, and then this would be our permitted number, right? So, Maria, this is your question. So I've done all this applicability determination. So what goes in my permit? And this is a quote from the Federal Register. We, that's EPA, also believe that it's not necessary to make future projections enforceable in order to adequately enforce the major NSR requirements. The Act provides ample authority to enforce the major NSR requirements if physical and operational changes results in a significant net emission increase at a major stationary source. So they're saying you don't have to put that number in your permit. That number, that's not necessarily to make it enforceable. What's going to go in your permit is the PTE permit limit and these monitoring and record keeping requirements. If the unit has a reasonable possibility, and that usually means 50% of the seal, of going over the projected actual.
So by using the projected actuals, how much push can you do for your special conditions?
You cite this back in their face and say, no, you're wrong. It should be PTE. There's no authority for you to do it otherwise.
For the PTE, yes, but for the special conditions, for example, right now we have a project that they are actually putting numbers in the special conditions. So they're saying, okay, you cannot go over this PDS number that you're giving me.
Well,
We have the same.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you need to be real careful, what you are monitoring, and maybe even put another meter on another line or something to make sure you're getting, true measurement of what's caused by that project.
Now, when you say the PTE limit, you're talking about an hourly limit there, not an annual. Aren't they gonna give you an annual based on your projected actual?
No, I'm talking about an annual limit. Yeah. So, and that's what, supposedly this is what catches you. This is what, this statement says, we think this is going to be enough. We don't think it's necessary to make that projection enforceable. You can still use that PTE in your permit for your maximum ton per year permit limit, but you're going to get this. You're going to get this record keeping and monitoring with it. And that's a concept that a lot of the TCQ permit engineers, they haven't gotten it yet. That this projected actual is just to determine whether I'm in or out of the program. It's just for applicability. When it comes time to set your permit limit, it still should be set on the PTE. And this is what's going to go in your permit. And I would use this, I'd use this statement, because it's pretty clear that EPA doesn't intend for this to go in your permit as a limit. It's just for applicability reasons.
So it's really two separate steps again. One, are you in or out? And if you're out, then you set your permit limit based on your project emissions, which is the PTE emissions. And one doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other.
So here we are, and be prepared for some agency resistance. These are the kind of questions you're going to get asked. Are the excluded emissions really unrelated to the project? Could you really have accommodated that? And the best way, again, is to use that 30 days of actual data. Will emission factors change from the baseline actual emission factors, or are you just doing an emission factor switch? Is it a paper thing? And why? Give us some data that you achieve this basis of over a 30-day period. You adjust it for utilization. Show us that reliability, efficiency, utilization increases are not related to the project, if that's what's causing that. In other words, your project ain't going to make this more reliable or more efficient, the project that you're doing. If it does, then it's related to the project, and it's got to be, and you can't say that you were able to accommodate it before the project. Show us that. That's the kind of thing they're going to be doing. So, it's frustrating because they're used to dealing with a PTE number, and it's a lot easier for them. And, I have felt exactly like Chris Tucker talking to Jackie Chan when I've gone in to talk to the agency about it, because this is exactly how I feel.
You understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Anyway.
I almost said that one time recently. Bruce almost said it.
Should I keep going, or should I turn it over to you at this point? I don't know, Bruce. Should I do Hovenza, or you want to come up? Or you want me to do Hovenza? Or so we're kind of at a break spot. Y'all want to take a short break? Y'all need a.
We got another coming up, another hour yet, so next break. We want to get up and stretch.
See what I tell you about him being mean?
Yeah, but,
They didn't have any, all they had was water. They had caffeine, I didn't see it.
You can buy one of these for $4 in the lobby shop.
For real?
There's coffee, I think, in that, two.
Is that your
Exhibitor,
floor?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Griffin.
in the exhibitor, there's
There's
soda
sodas and
stuff there.
coffee, but they didn't give it to us at lunch, which was. They're like, you can get drinks at the table, and it's like, there's only water.
Yeah, come back as soon as you can, and we'll kick it off again. What do you think, Bruce? Am I being videotaped? I didn't say that, Steve. I love you, man. Okay, let's talk about this other project. I put up 4 policy papers at the very start of this, and we've gone through a few of them. And this next one talks about significant emission increases, and that it's only the increases in step 1. This first project accounting, only the increases. And so let's talk about that a little bit. This came out of the Hovenza determination, and before that, a Radian old paper, 1997. You got them both on your jump drive. But basically, project increases at existing major sources are determined as follows. New emission units, it's the sum of the PTEs, right? No baseline actual, no prior actual emission, just add up the potential to emits. For existing modified emission sources or affected emission sources, the rules say it's the sum of the increases only, stay with me, from either the PTE or the project actual rate to the baseline rate. All right, we're still in step 1, so we're still talking about applicability, so we can use this either a PTE or a projected actual emission rate. And we just sum up those differences between that and the baseline. Only the project emission increases from new, modified, or effective facilities are considered in this step. Don't include project decreases unless they're clearly integral to the project. Okay? So I'm going to show you an example of that. And EPA, through the Hovenza paper, said basically nothing's really integral to the project. I mean, it's going to have to really be. Sure.
So let's say I have 2 incinerators, and one of them's old, and we're going to take the emissions that we were sending to 1 and send it to 2, and we're going to shut down 1.
Yeah.
Could I count the decrease from 1?
So.
I mean, there's going to be a decrease at 2.
Yeah.
There's also going to be a decrease at 1, and we're going to shut them down.
Yeah, incinerators are difficult because it's probably your it's probably your control equipment, right?
It is.
Yeah, but and then it's an emission unit from the standpoint that it's burning some natural gas and hot standby and all that kind of stuff. But you really, or it doesn't look to me like you're changing the emission unit. In other words, your emission unit is whatever is generating the emissions that you're sending to the incinerator, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So, they might say, well, the shutdown emissions from the hot standby mode or whatever from your incinerator, maybe those increases you can consider independently, and then maybe the decreases from the shutdown from only the natural gas, it's going to be a wash. Could go in, you can.
I'm going to literally take that 1 out of service and mothball it.
Right. Yeah. So so you're basically though you're just switching out your control. Yeah.
They probably have different NOx factors.
Yeah. That's a tough case. I think the current EPA might say that your shutdown, you could run your incinerator, your new one, without shutting down your old one. So it's not integral to the project. It's going to come in step 2 when we do the contemporaneous netting. I would argue that's not the case for anything except possibly the natural gas hot standby feed, where that incinerator is not a piece of control equipment, but it's actually an emission unit too. Yeah, I would say only that much, if anything, could be. Yeah.
And before this guidance came out, Randy and everyone else in the world permitted just that way.
Yeah, we can think twice about it.
Cork accounted before you shut down.
Yeah.
As part of the project, as part of the project.
Yeah.
But that's not what this reasoning.
So here's what the Radian case did. It was the first one that addressed this concept of integral process. And it was a shocker when it came out. This was back in '97. It consisted of a reboiler, which was going to increase the steam demand, a recycle line to recover heat, which is going to decrease the steam demand, right? And so the steam comes from a common header from several boilers. None of those are modified. The net steam demand increase for the project is 0, plus 10 for the reboiler, minus 10 to the recycle line. But EPA came out and said they didn't consider this decrease part of the project. And it could be counted only in step 2 netting when you got to your contemporaneous. And the determination was based on whether the heat recovery process was integral to the process, i.e., this is what EPA said, can the project operate at any time without the heat recovery process? And they said the answer is yes. And that the decrease wasn't integral to the project and couldn't be considered in this step 1 project accounting. So I love this because, yeah, so could have was good enough this time on the flip side, right? But when we're talking about could have accommodated on the other, they're saying no. So welcome to all of our worlds, right? This is the world we're living in now. This Hovenza case is even more disturbing to me. And I came in on the back end of this case to try to figure some stuff out for him. And besides getting a couple of trips to St. Croix, it was pretty much a disaster. I'm having a hard time still believing that it happened this way. So here's what happened. Hovenza had a consent decree, and they negotiated all that out. And I was fortunate enough to get involved in some of that. It was a lot of fun work. And then they had these projects that they were going to use to reduce their NOx emissions as part of their consent decree. Well, consent decree is enforcement in EPA, right? Permitting is not. It's Officer of Quality Planning Standards, all that kind of. So EPA is not talking to each other. They said thou shalt do these projects, but then they couldn't get them permitted. These are the projects that they were required to do under their consent decree. And when we developed the permits for them, we had a tough time. And this is what happened. We put in a project to refurbish and retrofit some of the gas turbines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, with steam injection to get some NOx control. We had oxidation catalysts for CO and VOC control. We modified another one of the gas turbines, 6, to allow it to fire cat cracker gas. And then we generated some additional power and steam by firing harder in some of the unmodified existing units. Let me show you what this looks like on a graph. Well, I'll do that in a minute. Don't worry about that. So for the project increases in step 1, oh, did I? I did. Here you go. This is where I want to be. Got an extra slide in there. So let's just look at this NOx. Can everybody see if I stand here? Let's just look at this NOx column. You know, we had some retrofitted gas turbine generators, and we're getting some big decreases here, right? And then we modified our gas turbine 6 to fire a little harder. So our modified unit totals, we had almost 1,000 tons of NOx reduction, right? And then for our affected units, the ones that were not modified, gas turbine 6 was going to have some cat gas going to it, so that's going to be a little bit of an increase. We're going to be running GT7 higher. We got a little bit of increase in there. And then all of our boilers we're going to run a little bit harder just to make up some steam for these gas turbine shutdowns, right? So we're adding all this stuff up together, and we still got over 600 tons of NOx reduction. And the clearly not subject to PSD, right? So what did EPA say about this? That's right. That's exactly what they saw. Yeah, I mean, we brought out the rules, which they didn't seem all that interested in. But basically, we said that contrast. There was a contrast on the wording for applicability for existing units found in 5251 that refers to the sum of the differences with the wording for hybrid units, which was the sum of the emission increases. So that's what the original consultant went in with for justifying that they should be, this difference in the language between some of the differences and some of the emission increase allowed us to take advantage of these gas turbine generators that we were retrofitting and take these big reductions for. I don't speak the freaky deaky Dutch. That's Austin Powers and Go member, but that's what essentially this thing boiled down to. You know, forget about us putting in a project where we had a 600-ton decrease in NOx. We're now arguing over the difference in these two phrases, some of the difference and some of the emission increases. And Hovensa originally claimed that since all the project changes were existing units, project netting in step one, termination of significant emission increases should be allowed. And EPA disagreed. They said that the same sum of the difference term is used in another part of the PSD rules to address project involving new emission units. They use the same sum of the difference. Well, since new emission units don't have a project decreases, the sum of the difference can only be interpreted as summing positive numbers, all right? And the preamble, the 2002 NSR reform ruling was conspicuously absent of any language which would, what one would expect with a fundamental change in PSD determination policy. So,
yeah, they use the misuse of a phrase to justify the misinterpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, believe it or not, the language is not perfect, even in the rules, and you would think that some, you know, common sense judgment would be, but, you know, things that sound alike aren't always interpreted the same. Here we have Roger and Victor and Clarence in airplane.
LA departure frequency 123.9er.
Roger. Huh? Request vector. Over. What?
Flight 209er clear for vector 324.
We have clearance, Clarence. Roger, Roger. What's our vector, Victor?
It's exactly how I felt when I was working Hovensa. I felt like I was in the movie Airplane, and we were just throwing around a lot of terms. But basically, EPA boldly stated that project netting is not allowed, period, under step one under any circumstances. And this was, I remember the day this paper came back, and we were all a little bit saddened, although I kind of suspected this is where they were going. So that's in your jump drive too. But the gas turbine generator project didn't fall out at step one, right? So we had to go through the PSD netting evaluation, and believe it or not, because we didn't net out either. So we were subject to a PSD review, which in the Virgin Islands, without a minor source program and everything, there was NOx EPA modeling required, and they couldn't model out. They couldn't model it out. So the project was terminated.
All because of permitting.
All because of permitting. And it's
Decrease in NAAQS is not allowed.
there. You know, there's probably other factors involved that I don't know about at my pay grade, but all I can tell you is that refinery now is a terminal. And whether somebody knew about that back then when we did the consent decree and they knew that it was going down, it was a partnership between Hess and PetroVesa, and whether they knew that or not, I don't know. But all I can say is that they spent a lot of money trying to make the PSD evaluation work, make the modeling work, and they were not able to authorize projects to give them a 600-ton decrease and let them continue to operate.
That is outrageous.
It's outrageous. What it tells me is we're more concerned about the administrative process, and if enforcement and permitting can't talk to each other, it doesn't really matter. They have their procedures.
You try to get them in the same room.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
wouldn't.
Yeah, it was, what's New York, Region 2? EPA Region 2, Region 1? Region 1, yeah, it was those guys, and they were just saying, you know, hey, doesn't matter what your consent decree says, we have permitting procedures that are codified and we got to follow them.
So what did enforcement say when you came back and said, hey, start permitting permit for it? Can you just
Shut down the refinery.
Yep.
They shut down the refinery.
Well, they didn't shut down the refinery. I mean, EPA didn't, but Petrovescent has did. They just turned it into a terminal and turned off all these fired sources, and it's basically, that's what it is. It's just a terminal now. A big refinery. It's not like it was a small thing. Probably 400,000 or 500,000 barrels per day. Huh?
They did that because they cannot determine the consent decree.
From my perspective, that's what happened. Whether there were other economic factors and this is all part of the grand scheme of things, I don't really know. I talked to the CEO, and I probably shouldn't be saying this on film, but you know, there could have been some other economic factors, and this was just, you know, I know when we went in to negotiate the consent decree, he said, we don't have any problems with these controls. We're going to put on the controls. We want to do the right thing. We just need to push our spending out 5 years. So when we start to commit to the compliance schedule, let's make sure that we don't spend an inordinate amount of money in years 1, 2, 3, 4. We can start spending this money in year 5. We're going to be okay. Well, year 5 never got there. So I'm speculating, Ginger, a little bit, but I will tell you, I don't know what would have happened if we could have gotten these permits to implement the consent decree projects that we committed to. And I will tell you, at my level, we were perfectly, we were moving forward on these projects. We really wanted them to go through. They spent a lot of money on modeling, not with Sage, but with another company to try to make this work. So this one is so messed up, this case, that it's actually got a double movie quote. The first one is the Terminator, hasta la vista, baby. So that's Arnold. And the second movie quote is a Caribbean movie quote for Hovenza. Close your eyes and pretend it's all a bad dream. That's how I get by. That's Johnny Depp playing Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates. So it was sad. That's kind of the craziest project I've ever worked on. So where are we on this one thing? We're halfway through the one thing. Here we go. A major modification means any physical change the method of operation. We got physical change, we got change the method of operation. We got major stationary source. We got that would result in. We got significant emission increases in regulated pollutants. That's what we've done. And now we're going to jump into the second part of this definition, and significant net emissions increase of that pollutant from the major stationary source. So let's do this contemporaneous netting next. You might want to skip over that. There's a flow chart in here that kind of, it was my attempt of trying to simplify what we just talked about this morning into a flow chart for, if engineers love flow charts sometimes. So you can take that out and look at it as you want. It's kind of neat because I've got little footnotes here and there that talk about, you know, could the change cause an emission reduction? So if you go down to the footnote, it talks about that causation language and all that. So that's kind of on the second page. When it talks about a new source, it's got a footnote that tells you that it's less than 2 years operation. It kind of reminds you of some of the concepts that we put in. So that's kind of some of the flow
And next time
through there.
somebody asks, from the engineering group asks for a yes, no answer, just pull out the chart.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes. no.
Yeah.
It's kinda-
That's where we are. Let's let Bruce take off with how we're going to net out a PSD.
So the good news is if you successfully had your project net emissions be less than significant, you don't have to do step 2. You're done already. And never do step 2 if you don't have to do step 2, because it'll just confuse the regulators of doing all this math and everything. When you have to pass both A and B, and you don't get to B unless you pass A. So If you don't pass A, just stop. Say I'm under. Now, if you're still over that threshold, that modification came out 16 tons. Even that little piece that was left in our graph, started out at 97 tons. It wound up at 16. That's still over 15 for PM10, or just 42. It's just over 40. A lot less than it would have been, but still over. So, have to go to step 2. So, what's step 2? That's the emission increases and decreases. Okay, now we get to finally talk about some decreases from the project, plus credible emission increases and decreases at the source over the past 5-year contemporaneous period. So you hear a lot about contemporaneous period, and now we're going to define that for you. And right here it says 5 years, but I'm telling you right away it's more than 5 years. So the net emission exchange exceeds the significance thresholds. There's a significant net emission increase, and federal review applies. So just like in step 1, if it went over the significant emission rate, which was the 40 tons, 100 tons, whatever, if your net emission increase goes over those same significance levels for the modification, then you have to go through no source review. Again, we're still just doing the applicability here. We're not doing anything else. We're not setting emission standards. We're not setting anything else. We're just seeing whether we have to go through new source review requirements or not by doing step 1 and step 2 of the netting analysis. So, 5-year period. Here's right now. You look back 5 years from right now, and you look forward to the project start of operation. Okay? So that's your continuous project. So your project starts right here, assume it gets, you turn the application now. That's where you kind of use the start point when you turn your application in. You start your construction, and then you get your start operation out here. This is the contemporaneous period you have to look at your project. So it's not just looking back, but you have to look forward until you actually start operations too. So that's your netting window. And looking back is easy, looking forward is a little tougher. So this goes again, that if you have projects that are going to come online before your project actually starts operating, you have to include them in this netting window, both positives and negatives. So, actual emissions netting window. More freedom is available when using actual emissions to calculate the contemporaneous emission changes, because different 24-month baseline periods can be chosen for each contemporaneous emission unit, even when dealing with the same pollutant. Okay? So before, in step 1, you had to use the same 20-month period for every pollutant, for every emission unit that was involved in the project, but you could pick different periods for different pollutants. Because that recognized that your printing press and your boiler aren't the same. It may peak at different times, but your printing press, you can't use it if it emitted VOC and particulate matters and NOx. You had to do it all the same for the same 24-month period. Here, the contemporaneous emissions, because a different 24-month baseline period can be chosen for each contemporaneous pollutant, you can go back and pick the optimal month for what you say that increase or decrease was during your netting window. So here, for a project we did it once, now we're going to do that same thing for every project increase or decrease that happened. So separate consecutive 24-month period to represent each emission unit that is part of the project. Okay. Step 2, what do you include? You include everything that's credible and not previously relied on. So if you just did a PSD permit and you included all these decreases in that permit, you can't use them again in this permit to decrease your emissions. You'll get the tone through all these recommendations that they're aimed at you trying to reduce your emissions by having something included. So it's kind of like, what can't you do with decreases rather than what you can do with increases. So when it says that you have to be credible, that means your decrease has to be credible. Couldn't have been relied on before to reduce your emissions. You get one shot at it. Once you use it, you can't use it for the next project. That decrease. You can't use it on the next project if you used it in the modeling on the previous project.
And if that previous project.
Right. was a PSD project. So in other words, if you used it and you drop below the threshold, then it's free to use again and again until it actually is used in PSD in the modeling to reduce the amount of emissions that you have to model and pass the ambient air quality standards.
Yeah, it essentially just kind of wipes the netting tape between.
Yeah. So yeah, so as long as you keep avoiding PSD, your projects stay out.
You didn't rely upon it in the issuance of the PSD permit, so it would have been a PSD permit. But yeah, in that case, it stays on there. But if you get a PSD permit, it pretty much wipes.
Right.
your previous period.
And basically, the next bullet says the increases you have to include, the decreases you can choose to include or not to include. So if you're going to go over anyway, you don't include them, you don't have to use them for modeling, you're going to pass your modeling without them, you can save them for the next project. If you have to use them to keep this project under, but your next project is more important and you want to save it for that project, you cannot include it and do PSD this time and not the next time. So we'll talk about that strategy here right at the end of the day today on manipulating those, but they can be saved for future projects as long as they remain in that contemporaneous period, okay? So if you pass the use up of using them to decrease something, sooner or later they're going to fall off the end of that contemporaneous period, you won't get to use them at all. But if they don't help you, or they don't help you enough, then you can save them for the next project. Okay, so here's kind of the requirements for the credible increase or decrease. Occurs in the contemporaneous period, not been relied on in the federal NSR, that's both PSD or non-attainment new source review. If you didn't need them because you passed the netting analysis or you passed the first project, then they carry on until you actually use them in a PSD permit. Their emission reduction has not been used as an offset. In other words, you didn't sell it to somebody else for a reduction, then you don't get credit again for it. You can't double count that way. And reduction has to be federally enforceable. If you take a reduction on something, it couldn't have been a voluntary thing that you can revoke at any time and start emitting again, okay? So if you didn't make it federally enforceable, you have to make it federally enforceable as part of the netting analysis in order to get credit for it as part of the project. Increase in emissions is credible if it is the result of a physical change in or change in method of operation of a stationary source only to the extent that the new level emissions exceed the baseline actual emission rate. Okay, what does that mean? Unmodified emission unit increases are not credible increases since they are not the result of a physical or operational change that increase the emissions and should not show up in the contemporaneous window, netting analysis, or modeling analysis. So those are those boilers that we never modified, but we had to include in step one because they were affected unit increases. Those kinds of emissions shouldn't show up in your netting analysis. Okay? This is just the physical modification stuff that shows up. So, right. So that, again, if you did all these projects in the past, one after another, and you netted out of it in step one, because even with the increase, now you have to put it on your contemporaneous window graph here. You don't include those non-modified project emissions in that total that we put on. We'll see some examples here in the next time. Okay, the emission reduction is real. It can't just be a recalculation, a new emission factor, or something else that came up that reduces your emissions. The baseline actual rate exceeds the new level of emissions. Emission decreases is voluntary. It's not been required by regulations, agreed to orders. In the case of non-attainment applicability analysis, the state does not rely on the decrease to demonstrate attainment. In other words, it can't be because it decreased because you had to do it because of an applicable rule. Okay, it has to be federally enforceable, but it can't be because of like a RAC standard coming in saying, now you got to control everything to 80%. Like those adjustments we made in step one, you can't take credit for that reduction in your netting analysis either, okay? So anything you had to do that reduced it because of a regulation or a SIP provision, those you can't take credit for as reductions in your netting analysis either. And the decrease has approximately the same qualitative significance for public health and welfare as attributed to the increases from that particular change. That goes towards switching one pollutant for another, or switching some fugitive emission that gets controlled compared to some toxic emission that goes out the stack and blows downwind. Generally, those stop at arguing about, NOx is NOx and VOC is VOC, but sometimes, whether benzene counts the same as, ethylene being emitted from plant, sometimes come into that balancing act, and they won't accept one trait for the other in a chemical plant. And then Texas would add that the decreasing emissions must be from the emissions that have been reported in the emission inventory. Again, they have to be something that they already have a record for. They don't want you making up that calculation at that point in time. They want to have it on the books already that establishes that's what their emission level was for that particular change.
Yeah, when the MSS rules came out, we argued pretty adamantly that these are not emission increases. We've always done maintenance, startups and shutdowns, and we shouldn't be triggering PSD applications because of MSS emissions that they're just making us document. People are mentioning, and we argued, and their only response was, well, they're new to us. We haven't seen them in any kind of permit or any kind of activity. They're new to us. But if you were putting them on your annual emission inventory, okay, then we'll reconsider whether.
So you have to, what did you do then? Did you just adjust your EIs to show them before you got them authorized?
Well, I suppose you could, but I mean, you're right. Nobody was asking for them, so why would we should put them on our gun?
I mean, I was fortunate when I was trying to authorize them, I was in a facility where the emissions were very low. The refineries are not in that situation. Degassing tanks and stuff is not small.
Certainly not small on a pound per hour basis.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are tweaking numbers on the tons per year to keep out of PSD from these maintenance, startup, shutdown operations that we've always been doing.
Excuse me. The other tweak to this is that, again, here we use PTE for your increases. The emissions you list on your contemporaneous timeline here, the increases have to be based on PTE, not your projected actuals. Now, the workshop manual that kind of is the only place there's really guidance says to use PTE for the increases. The reform rule didn't really say one way or another whether this projected actuals that you did maybe in these projects for the PSD termination last time you did it, whether you can use that number or you have to use PTE. Since the definition of net emission increase is for the changes in actual emissions, it seems reasonable to be able to use projected actuals for that. Except for maybe brand new sources where you don't have a baseline to subtract from, then you can use PTE. But fortunately, there's EPA guidance in April 2011 that specifically says use PTE for those netting. Is that the most conservative way to do it? Absolutely, that's the most conservative way to do it. So, okay, so why is the confusion? Again, it goes into trying to interpret plain language and put a spin on it. The amount by which the sum of the following exceeds zero, the increase in the emissions from a particular physical source or change in method of operation, or any other increase or decrease in actual emissions at the major stationary source are contemporaneous with a particular change and otherwise credible. So these are really the increases and decreases you get to count, but they want the PTE only to be not projected on actuals, but on the project-related emissions, which only can be potential.
Go back, Bruce.
Okay.
I want to make sure everybody's getting this. He's just reading out of the PSD rules. And in B, it said, any other increases and decreases. In what? I can't read that. Does that say in actual emissions?
Yeah, so it's actual emissions.
The rules state it. The PSD rules state it right there. And yet they came out with this long philosophical determination that, well, what they really meant was use the potential to emit in the contemporaneous period. And Texas has adopted that guidance. It came out of their 2013 Non-Attainment PSD manual, their guidance manual, permitting manual. So to me, this is like bizarre, and I'm sure it's going to get tested in court right away. But in the meantime, you know, we're stuck with a policy that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry, Bruce.
No, that's good that it doesn't. So this approach treats the project differently when it appears in subsequent netting analysis than when it did originally. So it's really resetting a rule that you do it one way when it's the actual project. When you have to go back and look at it in the past, the netting, you have to use a different set of rules for it.
Yeah, so this is TCQ saying, we're going to follow this. And, you know, we realize that it treats the project differently when it appears in a netting exercise. In other words, we realize you guys are going to have to keep two sets of books here. But we don't care. We're going to follow EPA.
Right. They have no will of their own.
Yeah, well, maybe you know what a zombie is. When a person dies and is buried, seems to certain voodoo priests who have the power to bring him back to life.
Horrible.
It's worse than horrible because a zombie has no will of his own. You see them sometimes walking around blindly with dead eyes, following orders, not knowing what they do, not caring. You mean like Democrats?
So there's nothing new under the sun, right? This is from Ghost Breakers, not Ghostbusters, but Ghost Breakers in the 1940s. That I know it's mean, but I couldn't help but dig just a little bit, following blindly this crummy EPA policy.
So here's some of the numbers, example numbers for the things we've been talking about. So here's the project now, you submit the application. And in the past, you had a 55-ton project, a 25-ton project, a 35-ton project in the last 5 years. Just past 5 years ago, you had a big 95-ton decrease project, which unfortunately is what? Off the end of the contemporaneous window slide. In the future, you plan also putting in some NOx reductions in the future. You got those already on the plate for scheduled in the future. Not related to this project, but they're going to come in a couple of years, and they're going to come before your project actually starts to operate. So they're going to be in the contemporaneous window. The current project's 100 tons per year. So is that a net increase of over 40 tons? Let's do the math here. We got 100 tons, minus 30, minus 25, plus 55, minus 25, plus 35. We're 110 tons. So our netting didn't really help us any get below 40, did it? It actually started at 100 and it actually got worse with the netting analysis because we had more increases over that contemporaneous window than we did decreases. Okay, so that's to me, this is usually the way it works out. You usually have more increases than you do decreases unless you have some big decrease projects. So you really want to get out of PSD in step 1 if you can, because step 2 is tough to balance your act, so step 2 actually helps you.
Okay, how is the current project up 100 and down 30?
Cut that down. That's just the increases and the decreases for
Right.
the same project. So, you know, that project like we talked about, where there's interval of the project, there could have been 30 tons that they considered not to be integral to the project, but once we got to step 2, it still showed up as a
Okay.
decrease.
Right. Yeah, so we couldn't show this decrease the first time.
But it's the same
Okay.
project.
Yeah. But either way, it would have been over 40 tons, even if we took credit for it. So we didn't have to fight for it very hard because it wouldn't have made any difference
In
anyway.
those days, I would have just listed that as a plus 7.
Okay,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I just kind of
okay.
Yep, can't do that anymore though. You gotta list it separately and wait till step 2 for that decrease. Okay, let's do another project here. This time, we speed up the project. We submit the application a little sooner, and now our contemporaneous window includes this 95-ton decrease.
because you had a really good consultant.
Yeah. So now instead of waiting another year and a half to get the project going, you say, hey, if we get this project going and submit the application now, our contemporaneous window will contain that big decrease we have, and we can take advantage of it. So all the other numbers are the same, but now with that 95-ton decrease, our project's only 15 tons, and look at that. You get the application quickly. So not only did you move the project, by moving the project ahead maybe a month or two, you saved a year off the other side by not having to go through PSD to get the permit. So then once again, all the other project increases and decreases, it's just taking advantage of that decrease before it fell off the back of your window. So one more example here where we had the current project. We didn't get going quick enough to get the 95-ton increase. But now this 55-ton project before triggered PSD review, and it was relied upon for the previous project. So none of those emissions increases or decreases are in the contemporaneous window. It got reset to 0. So all we have left on it is basically our 100-ton project and our minus 25-ton project that we're going to do in the future. So, and our 30-ton that we couldn't take credit for in step 1. So now our project increase is 45 tons, which still over 40 tons. So we're still have to do new source review for that project. So here's a case where either of these cases was over because we didn't get to use the 95 tons. This one's maybe a little, is actually less than 110 tons without the PSD being triggered because we had some negative projects we could do it. So anytime you clear out, you're going to clear out some negative projects. If you use those for one PSD, you can't use them for the next project in the same contemporaneous window. That makes sense, everybody? Okay, now let's look at it. Same as case 3, but the 25-ton decrease not relied upon in the modeling. So this time we had a PSD, but in that PSD project we didn't use up this 25-ton decrease from the modeling. The other increase was re-zeroed, it was relied upon. So now our totals are the 100 tons minus the 30 we couldn't use in step 1, minus the 25 that we saved over from the PSD permit, at minus the 25-ton project in the future. But all the increases were already relied upon in the previous PSD permit. Since it went over PSD anyway, we didn't need to decrease it, and we didn't need that 25 tons to pass the modeling or pass the BACT review, and so we saved it. And by saving it, it decreased this project then to 20 tons, and we don't have to do PSD this time.
Probably had a break.
Okay. So, one last point, and then we'll take a break, is the endpoint netting, and that's where, again, you modify the same unit over and over again. It cuts your break that you only have to do from the first time you modify it to the last time you modified it, and not do every PTE over and over again. That's the one break you get from the PTE analysis. So it's really the first PT, the PTE versus the final PTE established for the emission unit in the window. If you modify the same unit over and over, you don't have to do 6 PTEs, you only have to do 1 PTE for that project. And that might save you a lot of increases as a result. Okay.
If you go back to the other slide, in terms of the positives, so basically whenever you are doing your netting, you have to take your positives.
Right.
So that's why they're netting out here.
Right. Well, the reason this 55 was relied upon in the PSD. So this was actually a PSD application that got submitted. Where before it wasn't a PSD application. It wasn't. Somehow you got out of PSD in the previous netting analysis because probably you had that 95 tons to work with, so you didn't have to use it. Okay. So this time you didn't use it, and only the positive got counted. You used the positive, but not the negatives from that project. And the same thing, the 35-ton was relied upon previously too for a previous PSD permit.
Okay, so there were 2 PSD from.
Yeah, this one had 2 PSDs. The last one had 2 PSDs, but they also used the negative project as part of the balancing act in the permit. Maybe they need it for modeling, maybe they need it to, like I said, pass the BACT review or something. And so the modeling usually where you use it. But you can see the range of totals we got here for basically the same sets of projects was between 110 tons and 20 tons, depending upon how we used and didn't use the the decreases for these projects during the course of that 5-year time period. Okay, well, let's take a break. Well, let's forge ahead here. This is just the example of the endpoint netting. If you've got several projects in a row, you don't have to do the 25-ton PTE for each project. You just do it at the end. The PTE winds up being 30 tons. It started at the beginning at 15 tons, so it's 15 tons different. So that's one break on the, have to re-permit it every time. So the traditional, you'd have to do the 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 15-ton project. And this one, you just do the 30 minus the 15. So on the old way, if you had to do it, count every one as a PT separately, it would be 45 tons. Endpoint netting, same project, has to be the same project, can't be different projects you do this for.
Same emission.
Right, it has to be the same emission unit that you're modifying several times in a row over the same contemporaneous period again. Then you get some break that you only have to count the beginning to end credit, not recounting the PTE several times. Okay. So, step 2, netting using PTE. Use PTE in netting analysis. Remember, compare against the past actual or baseline emission. Check the SIP to see which one it allows. Different actual period can be used for each contemporaneous change. And though not intuitive or consistent, EPA and Texas have firm guidance on the use of PTE rather than projected actual emissions for contemporaneous changes. Okay, so don't try to use logic on that one. Just for now, accept the fact it's probably going to be challenged and that you have to use PTE for the time being.
Have you seen any evidence of other states that have not accepted the EPA guidance, or that are going against it, that are, I guess, making it known that they're going against it?
I haven't.
I haven't either.
Of a few applications that have done it in Ohio where they didn't do it this way, so it's gonna hit the fan pretty soon. But I don't know of anybody who's just gone out and said, no, we don't think that's what the rules say. This policy is bogus.
Yeah. This is a good point here that for states like Texas and Louisiana and others that have these simplified permitting, streamlined permitting things. Remember, every permit you permit is because there was an increase in emissions, right? Physical change with increasing emissions. And if you don't specify what that increase is, you got to use the PTE. Well, a PTE on a simple thing of what you represented as the actual expected actual emissions from it might be very small unless, some of these permits don't necessarily specify emission limits for insignificant units or something like that. And so when you go back and calculate the PTE from it, you might get this huge number that was not intended when you permit it the first time because you got this quick and dirty permit for it. So go back and look at some of those PBRs and some of the other ones to make sure that you can live with the PTE showing up on your contemporaneous timeline at the full PTE of whatever that project is. So.
That's confusing to me. Let's say I'm do some PTOs and it's like a half a ton. So what's the PTE on there? Is it the full?
It's
for the
the
what's allowed in one?
106.4, so it,
Yeah,
it
so
could be
should we
25
not
tons.
just,
So just sit in a PI7 that's a PI7 certification to make it enforceable, the actual thing you calculated, which could have been 2 tons or something.
okay, so a PI7, the unsigned thing, does that? We
Right.
don't have to do an APD cert or a
No.
PI7 cert or anything?
No, just a PI7.
Right. But without it, it reverts to whatever the 8760 at the maximum rate is. And
Yeah. Otherwise, they'll give you up to the PBR
Yeah.
limit, which, could be 25 tons.
Right, okay. Well, we didn't do it in PI7s, I just didn't.
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that
just keep doing your PI7.
I didn't think that established the lower limits, but okay.
It
good
does,
deal.
it does, yeah.
good. And then
I think that environmental people would do that to me.
They just did.
They did, that was completely a different language.
It's a Texas thing, yeah.
It is a
It's a nuance. The PBRs are an interesting, they're actually really handy. Like,
And other states are trying to adopt them as streamlining processes. Illinois has got grain silos so far. That's the only one that's got an expedited permit for it. It's working on 12 others, but they're all very, you know, car painting shops, things that are very small. Yeah. But that's a good point for anything. Keep track of those PTs when you permit it. You drop out, you think you got an easy permit, and it's, you know, it turns out to be 20 tons, 10 tons. Those are all add up. If you really only need 2 tons of that, you can make a federal enforceable condition that 2 tons. That's what your netting then will be. You can't go back and change it for after the fact for the project if you've been using it at that level. Okay, so we got through step 1 and step 2. So now you know how to calculate whether PSD or non-attainment new source review is applicable to your project. So we're going to put this all together in some quick steps, quick A, B, C, D, E, F. So 6 quick steps to go through. And these are all important for their own reasons. This gets a little bit more back to the basics, but don't forget the simple stuff as you're doing these complex concepts. One is figure out what the project affected emission units are. Project guys like to jump right into here's what we're going to build, here's what it's going to do, and then 3 months later say, oh yeah, we actually did modify this part of the plant too when we put in that new boiler, or we really modified this, we had to modify this after all to get this to work over here. So, right, well what happens to you? Yeah, what happens to you? The wastewater emissions now are fugitive emissions that won't pass the modeling, and you have to go back and recalculate everything from scratch to try to get your emissions not out in step 1 and 2, so you don't have to do the modeling because you aren't going to pass the modeling with those wastewater emissions coming out. So get this established early, get it established for real as much. Emphasize to your project guys that it's important to know exactly what the affected emission units are and the non-affected units are, so you can draw these boxes and not have to worry about any of the emissions, any of the netting, any of the project emissions, any of the emission unit changes, all of these kinds of things, if you have to include them in netting. You limit your world on what you're talking about once you get the project affected emission units. And those are both the new, modified, and affected non-related project emissions, okay? So that's step 1. It seems easy, but as you know, sometimes that's the toughest step of the whole process to get somebody to commit to what the project actually is, what projects you're going to be doing over the same aggregation period that we talked about before. You know, project might stall out and all of a sudden wind up being aggregated with another project because that one's in a hurry to get done, this one slipped its schedule, and now they're both being done in that same 6-month period, and you're going to have to explain why they're not related to each other if you don't aggregate them. So.
Yeah, but I was just going to point out that the way we got this labeled, when we talked about step 1 is doing the project accounting memory, and then first step in that would be step 1A, right?
Right, non-project.
Yeah. And if you do these things in this order, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. You know, I always like to try to get to the bottom line at the end, but it's not. This is a good order, I think, over the years.
Okay. 1B, establish the baseline actual emissions. So we're in step 1, second part, establish the baseline actuals using all the calculation methods we said, 24-month baseline period within 10-year look back, and that can be a rolling 24 months, doesn't have to be calendar years. We got a project where somebody asked me, can we do it on a daily basis? Can we take, instead of a monthly basis, we actually take 365 days times 2 and do it actually on a rolling daily basis? I don't know what to say because I've never seen summary emissions calculated less than a monthly basis for everybody, but they had daily data every day of the year. They had calculated rolling annual. I said, I don't know why not, but I don't think anybody's ever done it before.
And the wording of the reg says 24 months consecutive.
Yeah, they say months, so I assume it's months. But this is accomplished by selecting the highest 24-month during the last 10 years after making adjustments for shutdown, new requirements, all those adjustments we made, okay? So first step, getting that baseline down. Third step, make a projection of future actual emissions for each existing project affected emission unit. So clear that you can only include units must be justified by relevant information for the projector. You can't just take your 100 tons and subtract 1/10 ton, say, oh, that's my projected actual. It's going to be less than 100 tons. You have to have some basis for it to work your way up to that number. 2, process is complicated, may involve agency negotiation, additional monitoring. If you try to put too fine a spin on what your projections are and what you're trying to justify is less than the PTE. And finally, you can use the PTE rather than the PE to be conservative. And again, if it fits into the rest of your strategy as far as netting and everything else, as far as passing or not passing the applicability test. 4th step, calculate the PSD project emission change. Okay? Project change both increases or decreases for each project affected emission unit. Note, decreases will only be used if step 2 netting is triggered, not in step 1. PSD tests used depends on whether the emission unit being evaluated is considered new or existing. Okay, so if it's new, you don't have any baseline emissions from it, so the net is just the increase from 0. If it's existing, then you have to figure out what the applicable baseline emissions are for that unit, for the existing unit, and the projected actuals, and then do the difference between those two numbers. Okay. So again, remember, new units must use PTE. There's nothing to compare it to, and past actual is always 0. And existing units are allowed to use the baseline actuals, projected actual tests, but are also allowed to use the actual to potential tests. So just because we've been talking about how great it is to use that actual thing, don't forget you can use potential. You can simplify the application, simplify your discussions. If it doesn't make a difference, if you're still under and you don't need the emissions down the road, you can save some record keeping. You can save some analysis time with the agency as well. Calculate the project emission increase. So that's the sum of all the increases from the project without regard to any project emission decreases. So we did all the projections, we did all the increases. Calculate the decreases, but set them aside for step 2. You can't use them in step 1. Okay, not allowed to use the decreases, and the applicability determination for those subtleties we're going to reserve for you to read the rest of HOVESA on that progress. Last step, compare increases only to PSD trigger levels, and if over the considered options, avoid PSD at step 1. So before you get into all the demand growth and all that kind of stuff that again just complicates the application, see if you passed the first step without the demand growth and could have accommodated discussions. If you're under, then you're done. Take yes for an answer. Take the good news as good news, and just stop your analysis and say, I don't need a PSD review. Document everything, all the calculations you just did, put it in your file, and submit a minor source modification for the project. If you're close or you're going to go over, and you know that any little change they make down the road between now and the time the permit gets done, they're going to put you over, then go ahead and develop that extra buffer that you either need or could use with that demand growth or that could have accommodated emissions to decrease your projected actuals a little bit, to give you a little bit lower number to get under that 40 tons or the 15 tons, whatever you need to get under for the specific pollutant. Okay, and then finally, if project emissions remain above the trigger levels, the analysis must proceed to the contemporaneous netting. So always do step 1 first. Get out where you can. Like I said, most netting analysis add emissions rather than subtract them for most people. So definitely try to get out in step 1 if you can. Step 2. We've got 5 steps for step 2, and that's identify the project contemporaneous period. So we talked a little bit about that. It begins 5 years before the project commences and ends on the date the project starts operation. Not the day you submit the application, not the day you start construction, the day you start operation. So for some projects, that might be quite a ways out in the future. And you gotta take into account any projects that are gonna take place from the time you submit the application to the time you start operation and your netting analysis. And yeah, that's a little crystal balling that's gonna have to be done. What happens if you don't guess right and you wind up doing a big project during the construction phase? Well, you're responsible for going back and checking to see if your netting analysis still holds up. And if it doesn't, you might be expected to stop, go back, get a PSD permit or a non-attainment new source review permit to address the fact that your netting analysis didn't pass after all. So it's critical to let your team know that if you're doing this in avoidance and that window, you're close to that window, you're at 39 tons or something, and you're allowed a 1 ton increase until that thing starts operating, they have to know that, because a 2 ton project's gonna put them over. You know, they have to know that that's the consequence of just a small little project, possibly tripping retroactively a PSD project that you've successfully kept out of PSD. Now, if it's PSD project ready, everything goes to 0 and everything just goes on by itself, and you don't have to worry about retroactively tripping anything. You're already in the PSD. You're already in the new source review. So, the exception, like I just mentioned, is the PSD. If you've already got one, it resets the clock. You don't have to worry about the contemporaneous period going forward. You're at 0 for any new project. And can extend further back than the PSD permit issuance if everything was relied on up to that time period. So if everything was used up on that PSD permit, that's your new time period to start going forward. If you did a couple of little projects since the last PSD, they count, but anything you include in your PSD project up to then are kind of off the table, plus whatever slid off the back end of your contemporaneous window. Randy's got a good note here. Keep in mind, all this stuff is pollutant specific. We've been talking about one pollutant at a time just to simplify it, but we really, every one of these concepts applies to each individual one of those PSD pollutants on our long list. So the netting analysis, the baseline, the projected actuals, everything, you do that for every single one of those PSD pollutants to be a complete application. And all the netting and everything else, if you trip, goes into for the pollutants. So to avoid PSD, you have to avoid every pollutant, right? Trip any of them, you're in PSD. Okay, last one, identify the contemporaneous emission units. So again, just like your contemporaneous period, now you identify what units were modified over that contemporaneous period back 5 years and future to the point of operation. Contemporaneous emission units, non-project affected emission units, which had changes in actual potential emissions as a result of prior project which occurred during the contemporaneous period, okay? So those, again, you include those. We said that in the first project you had to include those, in the second project, in the step 2, you don't have to include them. Is that true? The other way around. Let's get this right. So you have project affected units and the contemporaneous emissions, non-project affected emission units which had changes or actual potential emissions as a result of the prior projects. Those get included in step 1, right, for our emissions, and they don't get included in step 2. So I probably had these 2 slides, should have been flipped the other way around.
Don't use a lot of logic here.
Yeah.
They just mess you up.
Identify past actuals for each contemporaneous emission unit. Again, baseline versus past actuals. The new source reform rules basically still have the word past actuals. Recently did a permit and they said, yep, that's true. We got to use the last 2 years unless you can really demonstrate they're not applicable.
Texas has the word baseline actual written to their SIP, so you can use the baseline actual in the contemporaneous when the EPA approved that.
Right. But again, check the states for that. When they write their own rules, they can write it either way. So definitely check the specific state rules. 4th step, calculate the contemporaneous emission change for each emission unit. So again, we did that. If you did it project by project, maybe even have that in your file already. But now you got to do it to the PTE. must be credible, and it must use PTE. Again, does that make sense? Is it going to get challenged? Probably, but right now it's PTE. And finally, the endpoint netting approach, if you modify the same emission unit over and over again, don't double count your analysis, only count from the first modification to the last. Fifth one, calculate the net emission increase for each of the pollutants and compare the sums to the major thresholds. This is all the pluses and minuses, and this is where you can use the strategy of when to count the negatives, when not to count them in your analysis. Do you need them or don't you need them in the PSD? You have to include all the increases. You can't decide not to include an increase, but you can decide not to use a decrease in the analysis. And finally, if the net emission increase is above the pollutant-specific PSD trigger level, then the PSD permit is required. If the net emission increase is below the PSD trigger, no further action for a new source review is required. Doesn't mean you don't still have to do a state-only permit or minor modification. Just means you don't have to do a PSD. So you don't pass step 1, you go to step 2. If you pass step 2, you stay under the thresholds, then you're out as well. If you're over step 2 as well, then you've over on step 1 and over on step 2, then you go to new source review. So, dozen steps to get you through the process. As we said right at the beginning of the program today, the key is in knowing that one thing, definition, and all the sub-definitions within that definition, and applying those all as you go through these individual steps. So, Randy, you want to go through some pitfalls? Now, I told you how easy it is to do. Now Randy's going to tell you all the mistakes you can make along the way.
All right, now that we've talked about this, it's going to make a little more sense to talk about some of these pitfalls. You know, the first one is the pitfall of Hovenza, and that's using, for your project netting, use your increases only. That's going to be, that's going to save you from some surprises at the end of your documentation. And I think keep our noses clean for the step 1. The other one is this crazy mandatory use of PTE rather than the projected actual, even though you did your applicability test on your projected actual. They're going to make you use a PTE when you evaluate those projects in the contemporaneous window. So the third PSD pitfall, I think, is going to be you know, this whole conservative policy for the projected actual emission test, where they make you use this 30-day period, and they probably squeeze you even some more on your definition of what you could have accommodated and what they think you did accommodate. I think that's going to be a difficult, maybe not a difficult sell, but it's going to take a lot of patience and persistence on your part to get it through. You just got to keep going back to the rules and keep going back to these policy papers. That's Northampton and Georgia Pacific, and make that happen. We got tighter NAAQS. I've been modeling for a lot of years, and I used to always tell clients, don't worry about the modeling, we're going to figure out how to make that work. I don't say that so much anymore for big projects. The NO2 short-term standard and the PM 2.5 24-hour standard really bother me. They're tough standards to model out of, you know, especially with low-level non-buoyant sources like engines that don't have big stack heights and stuff. It's really tough. And then if you trigger a facility-wide modeling, you got all this odor equipment that doesn't have the NOx control on it, or you know, we don't have good emission factors for combustion equipment for PM 2.5, so we're having to use AP42 factors, even though we all know they're bogus. You know, the agencies haven't really allowed us to do too much other than that without doing stack tests. So, you know, these standards and the modeling for the first time in a long time is going to be, you know, something that's going to, you know, potentially cause you a lot of grief with your permit application. Particulates coming out. We're going to talk on the last day about particulate and its many forms. We got PM, we got PM2, we got PM 2.5, filterable, condensable precursors, and there's a lot of issues associated with you know, SO2 as in NOx in ammonia as precursors to PM 2.5 and visibility. We're going to talk about how to overcome some of that challenge, probably on our last day, on our last morning. And there could be some BACT issues. Let's say SO2 is a precursor to PM 2.5 formation, but the control for SO2 is a lot different than the control for particulate. So if you trigger for particulate and SO2 is a precursor to particulate, does that mean you have to put controls technology on for SO2 as well as far as your PSD for particulate? So there's a lot of issues there that could be stumbling blocks for you, but I think we've got some guidance for you there. Boy, this one's a killer. We got new proposed ozone standards out, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. You know, EPA's proposal last fall was to get that somewhere between 65 and 70 ppm. It's at 75 now. They kind of left the door open to make comments for taking it down as low as 60. But they've also left the door open a little bit to leave it at 75, to take comments for leaving it at 75. Don't think that's going to happen, but we're going to beat that to death the last day because it's fun. And we've got maps that show you where the non-attainment areas are going to be, and it's kind of scary how much of the country and
I'll always tell everybody that that's never going to happen, and I still stand by it. There's no way. Because I mean, it's been,
Taking it down to 60?
yeah, there's no way. I mean, the entire state of Louisiana would be in the parish that I grew up in, or the county that I grew up in, doesn't have a single red light. It is so rules nothing but national forest, and it would fail. So how can they pass a standard where a parish with zero industry, except for one car dealership, would fail?
well, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's not logical, but there's the National Scientific Advisory Board who makes the recommendations to EPA on where to set the standards. They're supposed to do this every 5 years. They actually recommended to EPA that it would be ineffective to set a standard that was not less than 70. That was their recommendation last spring. And then they didn't stop there though. They went on to cite this National Truckers case study that basically said the setting of these standards has to have no basis whatsoever in practicality. It's just health effects or consequence. It's just health. It's just health related. So, I mean, there needs to be a tremendous lobby, and I think there is, but, you know, I wish reason was going to prevail. I'm less convinced that we're not going to go to at least 70. I mean, it's at 75 now. Are we seeing it go down from 120 to 80 to 75, and they got to stop it at some point because we're getting really close to a background concentration. There are a lot of studies that says, you know, we're getting stratospheric ozone intrusion from Mexico and China and everything else, and it's going to hit, you know, the American industries, the ones that are going to have to suffer and try to clean it up. And at some point, there's nothing else we can do. You know, it's frustrating. It just frustrates me to death.
I think maybe it's just something administration's doing just to pacify the environment, so they'll shut up.
I don't think.
Tried for 8 years.
No, they're true believers. They're not going to shut up. I don't think it matters what you get them.
I mean, if I was
But
president, that's what I would do. I wouldn't
Yeah.
really push it, but I would throw it out there and give them something to chew on for the next administration if it becomes a problem.
You know, I probably shouldn't get up on my soapbox, but you know, you thought greenhouse gas might have done that too, and some of the rules there. But it's not, and now it's ozone, and it's going to continue to pressure downwards until we.
Gas rules didn't come, I mean, they stuck them in the NSR regs where they don't belong, but if they would have, if Congress would allow them to be promulgated to the, with the regular rule like they were going to do before, then it wouldn't have been an issue.
Yeah.
Instead, they had to stick them in NSR, right?
That's right.
So if the government worked the way it's supposed to, which it doesn't, then it really wouldn't be a problem, right?
Yeah, that's why I put that thing, what constitutes policy, what are the factors, and the last one I put was politics. Boy, are we ever seeing that. So, it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds. And hopefully there's some reason in it, and some of it's going to, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but we'll make up time as we go. It all works out in the wash. I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on, are they just going to designate, even if they do get this lower standard, are they just going to put those counties and parishes and such that have a monitoring value that shows they're out of attainment? Or are they going to do some statistical interpolation that shows that they're likely to be out of attainment? Or are they going to give them some time to do some monitoring and really see? I mean, this thing could, before they take a drastic step like that, in my opinion, they should step back and get some better data and hard data, and then determine, is there something we can really do about it, or is this more a regional or maybe even an international type of problem, and we didn't go as far as we can go.
Or could I just get there and blame Houston?
Yeah.
It's kind of been self-produced.
I don't know.
We blame Houston.
You need to look at that monitoring data. You'd be surprised. The Dallas data is worse than Houston now for ozone. The Dallas data. Yeah. Dallas would probably have a non-attainment designation more severe than Houston, and Austin's going to be really close to Houston. And so, I mean, there are a lot of things going on, and I'm diverging, but if you take a look at the emission profile, even for the Houston-Galveston area, the most industrial area, maybe in the world, I don't know, and take a look at that emission profile, you'd be surprised how few of them, if you throw out SO2 specifically, you'd be surprised at how few of the emissions come from industrial sources. It's area sources, it's mobile sources, it's like, so here's the dilemma. EPA and TCEQ regulate industrial sources. They don't regulate area sources, the small mom and pop dry cleaners, gas stations, stuff like that. They don't regulate, any of that stuff. That's regulated at the federal level through emission standards for cars and through, this, that, and the other. There's only so much we're going to be able to do at some point, and it's going to have to take a little bit different direction, or at least include some, this is me on my soapbox, right? At least involve some regulation for these other sources that, because we just can't bleed the beat much longer. We are. We really are, Ginger. And that small piece, when I'm talking about the small piece, I'm talking about less than 20% of the emissions. Less than 20%. And if, you can see the emission profiles go down like that, but, they're population generated type of emissions for the most part. We've done a, yeah.
And I mean, it went back.
Yep. Well, it'll come up again. As soon as this comes up, people will start talking about driving 55 again. They'll talk about mandatory trip reduction policies for carpooling for industries over a certain amount. They'll talk about all this kind of stuff. Because that's the only entree they have. The only entree they have is through industry, and the rest of it's more federal regulations that have to be done outside of Texas and Louisiana. They have to be done through motor vehicle, fleet improvements, and anyway. So this is going to be a huge thing. This is going to be a huge thing. I think this is getting a lot less important right now. Greenhouse gases are, Texas went through a tough time where EPA was issuing them, and they made us go through rigorous BACT analysis to show that carbon capture sequestration wasn't cost-effective under BACT and all that. I think that's going to ease up. We won't have to do the cross-cutting issues like biological evaluation, cultural, historical evaluations, and all those kind of things that we had to do because EPA was the agency issuing the permit. So I think this is going to get a little bit bigger, but the ozone thing is, it's really scary right now. And I hope you're right. I hope some more practical minds prevail. We're going to find out pretty soon, though. So the first observation that we have is, if you want to avoid all this regulatory uncertainty and delay, just avoid PSD. Avoid it legitimately using the kind of steps to manage it that we've talked about, using these accounting rules, but there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the federal permitting program because of all these issues that we had on the previous slide. So you really should make every step possible you can to avoid PSD in most circumstances. Okay. Our second observation is that understanding how this project accounting works is critical, and understanding how these significant emission increases are handled, and how that's distinguished from step 2. When we get to step 2, we need, Bruce put up a lot of slides that showed how we could manage our contemporaneous window emissions a little bit better. Understanding that could be crucial to avoiding a PSD application, kind of moving that project schedule forward a little bit, or holding back some of those decreases so you could use them for your next project. All that kind of project scheduling and management of those critical reductions. And maybe even implementation of other reduction projects that you could slip in the window. That one project you turned out at 45. Well, it might have been pretty easy to slip in another, retrofit of a fixed roof tank to a floater to get another 5 tons out of it and net out a PSD that way. It'd be a whole lot easier than buying your emission offsets at a 1.3 to 1 ratio when they cost, $250,000 a ton. So you can pay for that retrofit right there. So, I threw up Jim Carrey here. I don't know if you guys remember in Ace Ventura when nature calls. He holds up the one dart and he said, "What is this?" And his buddy that you can't see in this picture said, "It's dart from Wachuchu tribe." And he said, "And what is this?" And his buddy said, "Also dart from Wachuchu tribe." And Jim Carrey said, "Only to the untrained observer." Right, so he knew that this second dart was a fake. And that's kind of the way it is with PSD, right? It's just like when nature calls. No, but what we're trying to do is give you guys a trained eye to look at these things so you can manage your emissions profile, because it's become a commodity, just like any other commodity. It's become a real important aspect for getting you out of a PSD evaluation and getting your project on schedule and avoiding maybe really costly offsets if they do designate half the country non-attainment or whatever. So that's what our recommendations are. That's kind of where we were. Remember, there's a 2-step process in all this. Let me turn the flip side of that with a case study. Since it's late in the afternoon and you're tired, I thought what I'd do was put the most complicated, convoluted project case study I could to help pull together these things. So, stand up, get a jumping jack, something. But let's go through this case study real quickly and kind of show you how some of this stuff could theoretically play out. So I made up this company. It's Chemical Solutions Incorporated, CSI, and they have a styrene monomer project that's coming up. And the start of construction is later this year, in summer this year, and full operation is going to be summer next year. The styrene monomer units, it's a new unit. It's got emissions from all the things you expect: storage tanks, process vents. some existing boilers and flares and fugitives. But they've also got this second project that's out there. They're also planning to construct acrylonitrile butadiene styrene, of course, I'm calling this an ABS unit, to expand their ABS production. You know, feedstocks are cheap. We're getting good, cheap natural gas, so this has become the chemical capital of the world, and CSI is going to take advantage of this. They're going to have two major projects coming up. Similar to schedule, it's running about 6 months behind. Starts December 2015, full operation January the next year. So again, about 1 year of a construction period. Pretty much the same sort of stuff. It's a new unit, emission from storage tanks, process vents, boilers, flares, fugitives. And there may be even some other projects out there. We're not sure about that. There's a further out in the distance, but they could have some polystyrene expansions. These are probably going to be smaller expansions. Could be a new styrene butadiene block copolymer unit. It could be constructed in 2017. Same type of emissions. Third project here, much smaller. So you're the environmental coordinator, and the capital planning team has come to you and said, hey, we got these things on the horizon. What do you think about getting them permitted? How's this going to work? What are we going to do? Well, the first thing you're going to do is go, wow, these projects are staggered about 6 months apart, right? And we went to the 4C thing, and that dude talked about project aggregation. So let's make sure these things aren't somehow aggregated in the mind of EPA. Can they stand this test of being independent from a technical and economic standpoint? Are the funding mechanisms the same? Are these independent projects, or do we need to throw them all together and look at them as one? So, because we are filing multiple permit applications in a short amount of time, there could be financial. You know, we looked at the financial ties between the projects, and CSI, bottom line is they're prepared to make the strong argument, Ginger, like you were saying, that the funding is completely different, funding mechanism. These projects are independent. They could go independently of each other. They're not tied in any way. So they're willing to do this, so we're going to move forward with the permit strategy. So we throw it up on our chart like we did before. And we're looking at the first project, the styrene monomer project, and we got some baseline actuals because we got some swing boilers included in here that are much, much lower than the potential to emit or the projected actual either before the project or after the project. So we went through our analysis here, and we're trying to figure out what our projected actual emissions are without our project, because this is the amount that we were able to accommodate before, and we're going to reduce our permit amount by that much. So we do that, and we get an adjustment of 611 tons, which means that we got about 62. If we use all our tricks we're able to accommodate projected actual, and everything that we learned here today. You know, the lowest we could get it was 62 tons. So we're still over 40 tons, right? So we triggered a netting analysis. We've triggered contemporaneous netting here for our first project. So here's the way when we look to our project increases and decreases over our contemporaneous emit, we notice we got a big boiler shutdown right here. We got about 140 tons of that. I mean, all this still adds to the 62, but we got some other projects that we got a new boiler in their window. We got a couple of other things that we're installing SCR on another boiler, so we get a little bit of credit. And we got our basis for our calculation. You know, this is a decrease, so it's actual emissions. They're all credible, right? This is a new boiler rate, so it's a new project PTE. This is the copolymer expansion project, just some flare stuff. So it doesn't really matter too much. We're doing a PT minus past actual because we don't want to do record monitoring on this flare. We've installed SCR on this, so this is we're using PTE because it hadn't really happened yet. It's pretty recent project, and we don't have an actual emissions, so we're just using the PTE on that to get that one down. And then we've got some emissions from our flare from styrene monomer, and then this is the project we're trying to permit now, right? So how does all that play out? We added up all the stuff, and we get 47.21 tons. Still over PSD of 40, but pretty close. Pretty close. So we could probably do a few things if we wanted to. If we wanted to, the low-hanging fruit might be, right here and right here, or these, we could sharpen our pencil there, and maybe get that 7 tons and get under PSD, or not. So here's the strategy. So without further credible reductions in our window, this thing's going to go through PSD, right? And we might want it to in this case, because modeling, if we pass modeling for this project, because there's no short-term emissions because of the boiler, the swing boiler operated pretty close to its capacity in the past. So we're not worried about pound per hour, but there's some big tons per year here. And we could probably pass the modeling for the project. And if we trigger PSD, we remove this huge PTE minus the past actual test once this project is in the contemporaneous window for the next project, right? We said that, once this project gets into the contemporaneous window, TCQ and EPA had this crazy idea that it should be PTE minus past actual, or really should be baseline actual. So our PTE is high on this boiler. Our past actual is pretty low, so we got just this enormous, gigantic increase that's going to show up in our netting window for the second project. So we might be better off just to go through a PSD review and wipe that slate clean in this case, because we know that second project's coming, right? So this project never enters our contemporaneous window. So
Why doesn't it fit in the window?
well, if we go through
If we do a PSD permit.
yeah, if we get a PSD permit, then we will have we would have
Show up on the, okay.
yeah, we would have kind of zeroed out our thing, and then just the only thing that's going to show up is this net, this increase of our second project. That's the only thing that's going to be left. But if we don't, if we try to lower these 7 tons to net out of PSD, once we move this project to another project in the contemporaneous window, we got this big old number to deal with, and we're never going to net out. So we know we got to go through PSD on the second project. So we're saying, well, maybe we should just go through it for the first one and zero it out. The modeling is going to be pretty much the same, and we can authorize it that way. So this is crazy stuff. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Apocalypse now, but yeah, but we might want to optimize our permit strategy by.
End of the day, they're finally getting into the movie quotes there.
Yeah.
Finishing the movie quotes.
We probably felt a little rushed. That whole fire drill this morning thing is, I feel like I'm catching up, but we'll do more of the movie quotes. This one's a killer, though. I feel like I've been napalmed when I read this policy paper. So let's look at how this is going to work. We got our baseline actuals, our projected actual without our project modifications is working out. This is the second project I'm working on now, right? Let's move away from the first one. This is that second big project that's coming up. So we got the kind of same sort of thing. We got this projected actual that we could have accommodated at this point, and then we adjust the PTE down. And the second project has got a project increase, a project accounting of 65 tons per year. So we're going to go through PSD on it too. So where does all that leave us? If we move to step 2 for the second project, if we triggered PSD for the first project, we remove that big increase from the window, and we've only got this second project increase to deal with. Right? It's just everything else has been zeroed out of our contemporaneous window. So how's that going to look on the contemporaneous window? We've got our current project with 64 tons. We maybe didn't use this decrease because we didn't need it to model out. And we've got this, if we hold back our decreases on this second project, we can easily net out of the second project if we didn't model those decreases. So the second project's not a problem because we didn't model these big decreases here. We left them in for the second project, and bingo, we're done for the second one. For the second one, right? So it might, this one might be a case where you got to go through a PSD analysis anyway. Why not get rid of that? Why not work your contemporaneous window magic such that you don't have this big boiler increase ever entering your contemporaneous period? You're going to be modeling more like the 64 tons for your second project to get it through, rather than everything else, that big increase in the project. So here's, and if we didn't do this, if we avoided PSD in the first project, this is what the second project contemporaneous window would look like. And then we'd have this ginormous increase because of the boiler, right? From the styrene monitor project, from the first project. And we'd be looking at some crazy numbers to have to model. So it's a little confusing, but you can see where this policy, the EPA and TCQ, of making you use the PTE minus the baseline actual once the project gets in the contemporaneous window, where that really bites you hard for future projects.
Well, why didn't the new Blower 9 trigger PSD and require modeling, and it resets the contemporaneous period?
Probably because of this big decrease in the window. It probably netted out. So there, even though this was maybe a big project, this decrease was still there. So it was below 70. I mean, it was below 40 tons once you did that step 2 contemporaneous netting.
And I think if they relied on those decreases before, you couldn't use them in the netting.
Correct. The one that you're absolutely right. We're making the assumption that we didn't have to model those decreases for the first project in order to pass. But we're not that worried about it because the tons per year they would just model against the annual NAAQS, not the short-term NAAQS, because the boiler ran at full capacity. So the short-term emissions really didn't have much of a change. It just the tons per year number went up because it was having to make more steam, more hours to support these new units. Okay.
So if you have two projects like the last two, Boiler 5 and 6, I mean, I thought you could aggregate those. Like, you don't have to do actual potential twice. You can do actual to potential of the end result. So you would be double counting your emissions, right? So So if you have 5 projects affecting one source, you don't have to do the delta for sum up the 5 deltas. You could do the.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is the same project, we're not modifying twice, this is just carrying
Yeah,
over
this-
from previous old projects that we're counting in our netting analysis,
Yeah.
that haven't happened yet. So these are actually in the future contemporaneous part of the period. They're projecting gonna happen in the past.
Yeah, but you're right, if you had multiple changes with the same emission unit, you could perhaps do some endpoint netting magic and get that number down. But that's a great point. That's a great point.
But it looks like the 64 already took advantage of that, because it's only 64, not 800. So it obviously didn't.
Well, this is our current,
potentially.
yeah, this is our current project.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, even if we do that, we still got that huge 900-ton potential to emit. That's what's killing us. You know, in our reality, what these folks would probably do, I would recommend to CSI, my fictional company, that, hey, you may not need that potential to emit. You know, you guys ought to go ahead and give up some of those tons. You're never going to use them, and they're killing you. What do you really need? You know, you've had this thing operating now for 10 years, and you've never been over 400 tons or 300 tons or something like that. Do you really need 900 tons of PTE? Because it doesn't appear that you ever need to do your boilers that way.
It's not like you can save them because they're not real emissions, so you can't use them any down the road.
Exactly. Great comment. You know, but boy, the plant manager doesn't like to hear you talk like that. I mean, you're absolutely right, and that's kind of like a paradigm shift that we have to start thinking that they're not really usable. I mean, you have a new project, you have to count for them, and your project increases. But you know, you go talk to your plant manager and you say, you know what I'd like to do is, I'd like to decrease my permit limit. I'd like to cut it in half on those boilers, and they, you know, that's all they can hear is like, look, you know, we went crazy trying to get this permit limit. Now you're telling me you want to cut it in half? In reality, what you said is true. You don't really have it anyway. You know, so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. So if we allow this first unit to go through and trigger PSD permitting, and we could hold back some of these credible decreases from our big reductions, we can avoid the PSD permitting for the second project, okay? But if we're going to look to any of these additional projects, we're going to be in the same situation again. We're going to have this huge number for any third or fourth project. We're going to have this huge number from our second project. So we might want to go through a second PSD review just to get rid of it too, just to buy us some insurance for any project that might require netting over the next 5 years. And that's why it's kind of important when you're doing these permit strategies to know what the 5-year business plan really looks like. So and boy, is that a tough thing to do? It is. I mean, who would have known 5 years ago that the feedstock prices would be as low as they are, and that, you know, permitting would be trying to take care of, you know, there'd be these big expansions and all that. I mean, it wasn't that long ago we were building cat crackers because everybody was going to heavy up. You know, and now all the feedstocks all the crude's light, and nobody wants an atmospheric distillation. I mean, a vacuum distillation. But our considerations for accepting a second PSD might be that the modeling should pass on the second one. If we did the same thing on the second project, we would remove that decrease, buy some insurance on our third or fourth project, and again, consider not modeling those decreases. So if we got into a situation, we would have some of those decreases still on our window until they slid off the window. We would have them for the third or fourth project, and like I said, buy ourselves some insurance. So that's it. One other thing I'll tell you is when you don't rely upon those missions, when you don't model them, they won't let you use just the amount that you need. You have to use it at a project at a time. So when I hit like that 139 ton decrease, I have to use it either on project 1 or project 2. I can't use like 75 tons of it now and the other, whatever it is, 60 tons later. 59, 60, I can't do math. It's too late in the afternoon for me to do math in my head, but you guys got it. So that's it. That's the PSD permitting. You know, the recap is that all methods to calculate the emission increases, including the baseline to potential actual, are used in step 1. However, only the PTE minus the past actual is available in step 2. And that's just a big bear right now we all got to get over. So you might well recommend, in this case, actually going through a PSD review for the styrene monomer project, emptying the netting window, and even consider going through a PSD on the second project to again empty the netting window so you would have some ability to get in a project that was, you know, that would be big enough to at least trigger netting. Because if you didn't, once you got into a netting, you were sunk. All right. So that was kind of another one of our agenda items. Bruce, do you want to try to go through BACT real quick? Or you want to go through this quicker? You know, I'll go through it real quick. I mean, we added this module, and because a lot of people were wondering about what we can do before we get a permit, what pre-construction activities you can do, and what are some of the policies regarding.
So, for example, we've gone through this whole exercise now, and you find out you got to do a PSD permit. So you got to break the bad news to the team that, you know, it's going to be a year before we start permit probably. And the first thing out of their mouth is going, well, what can we do in that year? Guarantee that's the first thing they're going to ask you if they haven't asked you already. What can we do while we wait for our permit?
Right. Right. So, yeah.
Several times over there.
Not a whole lot. You're right.
So if there's like, this is something that I've always just told them, look, you can't even prepare the ground really for whatever you're gonna build. But there's already a building on the place, they wanna build a new facility. So they said, can we tear down the building?
Yes.
I said, yeah, you can tear down the building, take that building material off, but you can't really prep the ground for the new construction.
Yeah.
Is that,
You can do some site preparation work, but it's like once it's there, you can't begin any excavation of the ground. You certainly can't pour any concrete. You can't do anything of a permanent that has to do with an emission unit, which is of a permanent nature. So we'll get into some of this, but what TCEQ said, I mean, these activities include, but not limited to, installation of building supports, foundation, underground pipe work, construction of permanent storage structures. You can't enter into contracts, of course, but you know this leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So let's look at somehow this policy's unfolded. And I got some of this stuff right off the TCEQ website. And it says, construction shall be broadly interpreted as anything other than site clearance or site preparation. More specific comments was all works, excavation, form erection, laying of steel pertaining to foundations upon which permit units will rest shall be considered construction. For permit units not requiring a concrete foundation, the erection of construction of associated like earthen dams, placement of pilings. Here's something you wouldn't expect. Soil stabilization. Storage tank fills or retaining structure shall be considered construction and not allowed. They don't stop there. They said equipment they received at a plant site and stored. In other words, you can have a laydown yard or something like that, provided no attempt is made to assemble it. So you can get all the parts there, you just can't start putting them together. Or to connect the equipment to any electrical, plumbing, or other utility system. All right. And they didn't stop there either. They said land clearing, soil load bearing tests, leveling of the area, sewer and utility lines, road building, power line installation, fencing, construction, shack building are considered site clearance preparation. So they give you a little bit of guidance on what you can do. They're saying, now Texas does, right, on their website. We're going to go through an EPA enforcement action that kind of isn't completely consistent with this, but that's what they're saying. They're saying all that stuff you can do. You can put up fences, you can put up utility lines, you can do a few other things like that. However, this is key, and this is consistent with EPA. It said, however, once soil and site are ready for foundations, the first excavation into the soil, the readied soil, is start of construction. Okay, so you can kind of level it, you can kind of clear it, you just can't excavate it all. So, so we have all that in place, and here comes EPA, and they did a notice of violation. This is an enforcement division, did a notice of violation to a company called Steel Dynamics. And they listed a bunch of activities which they considered permanent in nature. Remember that permanent at an emission unit? That were permanent in nature, integral part of the overall construction project, and have significantly altered the site and were costly. So they're laying out some criteria here. Is it costly? Is it permanent in nature? And then they got more specific in that. They said, consequently, these things they deemed to begin actual construction. Excavation of a freshwater lagoon to provide processed water. So they dug out a lagoon. They considered that started construction. They did some excavation, being a key word here. Excavation of a drainage system retention pond. They said that was started construction. Excavation of ditches and installation of several culverts. Wow, that's kind of harsh. They said that was sort of construction. What's that?
No emission sources in a ditch.
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I think that would just be kind of water runoff management or something like. Yeah. Yeah. So they even get crazier after that. Preparing of the foundation for laying railroad track by adding crushed stone to the soil. Okay. Adding lime to the soil. I wouldn't think of that as, I would think of that more as site preparation, but they specifically called it out. And of course, fabricating, steel, any kind of steel parts. And they basically said without your permit in hand, these activities could lead to an enforcement action, which they did with Steel Dynamics. Is started construction different than commenced construction? We got two different concepts here. The general conditions of my new permit says I must commence construction within 18 months. When you get your permit, you get the general conditions on the first page of it, and it says you need to commence construction with 18 months, or your permit becomes invalid. This is in the PSD rules. So that's what commence construction is all about. It has to do more with when the timing to start your project. So to fulfill this obligation, you got to do one of two things: begin actual on-site construction within 18 months, but it's real easy to get an extension for another 18 months, or you can enter into a significant contractual obligation, and they consider that to be one that can't be avoided without losing at least 10% of your project costs. So they say, they don't want you just getting a permit and waiting 3 years to begin construction, because a lot of BACT could change, a lot of things could change. They want you to begin construction, they want you committed to the project, or they want you to come in and get the project reauthorized when you're ready to start construction. So that's it. I was...
having a unit that they're restarting it, the unit is still there, but it was like out of service for 10 years. So we're permitting as a new unit, right? But what they wanted to do is take off some part of that unit, send it off-site, repair it, and then bring it back. Is that construction?
As long as they don't try to assemble it, I don't think it would be. You know, but if they tried to, if they just laid down the parts, if they had it all in a lay-down yard and they weren't trying to assemble it or anything, I think that would be fine. Once they start putting together the pieces and putting in the concrete support and all that kind of stuff, or actually putting the thing together, it appears to me that would trigger start of construction.
Usually deconstruction doesn't need a permit. You can tear something down to the ground and not require a permit. But as soon as you start reassembling it for some other source, or if you take it down and leave an area, remodify an area to allow something else to be constructed, then that's part of that construction.
Maybe I should leave the Caddyshack quote for later reading, but it was my favorite movie quote on the occasion of a commencement, like commence construction. I'll read it. It's easy to grin when your ship comes in and you got the stock market beat, but the man worth his while is the man who can smile when his shorts are too tight in the seat. Okay, Pookie, do the honors. I don't know if y'all remember that, but he hits the champagne bottle on his little boat, and yeah, so, okay, enough of that. Commence construction, 18 months to commence construction. You can request an extension, case by case. It's easy to get if you want to do that. The second request is usually they're going to say, no, just send us in a new application. You know, Bruce brought up that you need to be careful with the potential changes in attainment status, especially we could have some changes in attainment status. The 1991 memo, although owed, from OEQPS issued a memorandum stating it would be inappropriate to extend the PSD permit expiration deadline for permits issued to sources in areas that had been designated non-attainment following permit issuance. So, you know, if you got your permit and then your area gets designated non-attainment, boy, start that construction within 18 months, because they're probably not going to give you an extension.
How long of extension can you get?
I think it's pretty easy to double that 18 months, get 36.
I'm sure y'all heard, we got a PSD permit, we submitted a PSD permit back in April for all pollutants, PSD for all pollutants for a big project, Maryville called Roof. Residual upgrade, expansion, and it went to public notice last week or the week before. And that exact same day, the board killed it. So we've gone through, the board decided not to fund the project on the same day it went out to public notice. So, but we have a lot more capital projects rolled into the PSD permit, so it's still gonna get issued. So, if you have a huge project that makes everything go PSD and you roll 3 or 4 other capital projects in with it, and you're only gonna do the 3 or 4 small capital projects, how can we ask for an extension for the main one that caused everything to go PSD when parts of it are gonna get done? Does that make any sense?
Parts of it aren't going to be done?
Are gonna be done.
Are going to be
It's
done.
a bunch of projects all rolled into one.
Yeah.
Can we go back and can I go back and submit a letter asking for an extension on the big group project? Even though the other small projects are going to be done and completed? How would you word that?
Well, I mean, did you just put the projects all together as a convenience?
Yes.
Or did you evaluate them as if they were one project for PSD and just said?
Convenience.
Okay, so, you know, I wouldn't.
Because remember, our construction permit and operating permit is the same permit.
Yeah, yeah. I wouldn't think you would have a problem. You know, you've already been through BACT and review. It doesn't change your PSD applicability determination. You've already said, you know, we've gone through PSD review, and you've gone through BACT review. You've gone through impacts review at this higher level, and I would ask for that extension on
You
the,
even have to ask for an extension
Yeah.
if it was, why would you have to? If he's gonna.
well,
do
he's
the
going over
three
his
small-
18 months, right?
But if he's gonna do the first three, like the three small projects that were lumped in with the big one, you're not gonna do the big one, you're gonna do these now, and within the 18 months, can't you just say, hey, I commenced construction.
We might want to do the big one later.
Yeah, so it depends on the time frame, because most of the definitions talks about when you can commence construction, and it's a continuous, you don't have delays in construction of more than 6 months. So if you're gonna have a delay in construction, I would ask for an extension.
Because it's gonna take you 3 years to construct the other little sources, and you got 3 years plus 6 months for the start of the big project. If you apply for extension, what you get is the 36 months, the 3 years as well. So you balance how long construction is gonna take and add 6 months to it for continuous construction, or you have to do extension
Yeah.
for the regional project.
If we get the PSD permit, we're gonna get the PSD permit, and we don't build the big project, we set our contemporaneous analysis back to 0 for all pollutants.
I'd need to know some of the specifics of those emission. Did the other projects alone trigger PSD? Yeah, that's a complicated question. My knee-jerk reaction is it probably would be as if it never were. And most of the time when you're looking at a retroactive PSD review, the agency's philosophy is that how would your permit and your permit application look now, would have looked then, knowing what you know now. So I'm guessing, you'd have to go back and make your window look just like that PSD project never happened.
If your whole bunch of little projects would have tripped PSD without the big project, because they're just over 15 tons or whatever, then you probably would have had credit for the whole analysis and reset everything. But if they wouldn't, then they wouldn't give you PSD credit for it.
But if you went through all the trouble, and, really, if
Maybe
we went through all the trouble and did modeling and stuff, and we passed and went through, public comment, why couldn't we take advantage of it and reset our window to 0?
It's good for 18 months.
Yeah. I'll give you a little bit of hope. I always get in trouble when I try to practice law, but it doesn't stop me, usually. But the wording says that it's emissions that were relied upon in the issuance of a PSD permit. And I'm guessing some attorney could probably grab that and run with it a lot better than I can. Those emissions were relied upon if you got an issued permit. It doesn't feel right to me. Yeah, but it doesn't feel right to me. I think they would say, well, you didn't really get the permit in good faith. You guys knew you weren't going through with this project. I think it would become somewhat of a legal matter at that point. So my gut feel is at the end of the day, going back and forth, they're going to make you reset your window and not let you say that you relied upon those emissions and issuance of a PSD permit because your PSD project never was, what's the word I'm looking for? Implemented or consummated. Yeah. I don't know.
Back and forth, and I was learning.
That's why I get the little bugs for not being an attorney, and they get, yeah.
On the flip side, when you get a permit to do something, the government doesn't require you to build it just because you get a permit for it. So you have a permit, you build something based on getting a permit for it, you finish the project. The netting analysis is questionable, but everything else you do is more than up to the for it. You can use that permit, a big permit, to build anything within that permit and not build anything if you want to. But you're constantly trying to use it and apply the actual emissions that happened and didn't happen, that you get more complicated. I think Randy and I would have to put our heads together and chart it out for you.
So I'm tempted to go into these construction-related emissions, but I'm not. We're getting pretty close to 5 o'clock, and you guys have been so patient today. I think we're going to let you go. Just let me say maybe one more minute about construction-related emissions. You know, in my opinion, this is another one of those sleeping dogs. The rules aren't very clear at all how you deal with construction-related emissions. You know, some people, best I can tell, some people consider them secondary emissions. I don't think they are secondary emissions. I think secondary emissions are emissions from an outside source that, if not for your project, wouldn't exist, but they're other people's emissions.
You build a shopping mall, the cars
Yeah.
wouldn't drive to that location.
Yeah.
There wasn't a shopping mall there.
But this is another sleeping dog in my opinion, and EPA is largely pretty silent on it. Usually they consider construction-related emissions as being temporary emissions and not subject to PSD. But that whole idea that they're temporary emissions and not subject to PSD throws you back to, well, what's temporary? And temporary can mean a lot of different things in different programs. You know, the Rice MAERT and some other things, you know, they have like a 6-month trigger and 1-year trigger. Texas considers temporary emissions sometimes 6 months. I've got EPA policy papers, and you've got them too now in your jump drive, that talk about temporary emissions for PSD applicability purposes, in some cases going up to 2.5 years. So there's really not much clear guidance. But as we get into these big construction projects, it's not unusual to see a construction project go 2.5 years for, you know, major grassroots construction. So, you know, it's just kind of one of those other things that's lurking out there. One of these days, you know, some agency is going to go, hey, can you guys calculate your construction-related emissions, and can you show us that they're less maybe than your project emissions, so you modeled them okay and everything's cool. Just another thought out there. I'm not going to go through all the slides because it's late, but that's just kind of one of those things that's fun to talk about, but we really hadn't got a whole lot of guidance on it yet. And it could go out there. California makes you list the equipment you're going to have on site during construction, and that's about as close as I can see anybody actually doing a pre-authorization of your construction activities. So,
Get them under their variance. You gotta get a variance for construction.
is that right?
And, got the variance, the state's normal thing is they won't issue variances for over 5 tons. However, we've gotten construction variances for major projects that went through PSD up to 40 tons.
Yeah.
And, as long as, you know, it didn't go over the permit limits that we had just received, so it'd be like the source is already in operation, but they just put it in as a variance. And mostly diesel engines and welding machines and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that's good. That's news to me. So we didn't get to BACT, but we'll get to it tomorrow morning. And Bruce will kick all that out. But you guys are great. We did it. We made it to the first day.